All right. I'm Renee Dehan, and it is my great pleasure to be here with Simon Hill. Simon Hill is the founder and host of the wildly popular blog and podcast, The Proof. He has a bachelor's in physiotherapy and a master's in nutrition science, and outside of his formal training, he has really made a lot of impact in his career, interpreting and reading scientific publications, and then feeding that information that he has learned with his expertise to a lay audience to help us all make better decisions about our choices, our health choices, and our lifestyle choices, etc. In 2021, he published the book, The Proof is in the Plants, with Penguin, and after the first week, it skyrocketed to #1 nonfiction Australia-wide. He also facilitates 6-day-long immersive longevity retreats where you can go and participate in a small group to learn firsthand about how to optimize your health span and longevity. Thank you so much for being with us here.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and been enjoying getting to know the Insight Tracker family, and there's a lot of alignment between everything that Insight Tracker does and what I do. So it's great to be joining you.
Absolutely, no question. And we are delighted to have you. And we'd love to start by just hearing more about your own health journey. And how did you get here? How did you become interested in nutrition and exercise and really health span improvement?
Yeah, the interest in science goes back to when I was a little kid. Mm-hmm. I was born in Melbourne, and then we spent a bit of time here actually in the States. My dad had a job transfer. I was surrounded by science from as far back as I can remember. I'd walk into our home and there'd be scientific papers printed and scribbles on them, and Dad would have highlighted certain things, and I had no idea what these documents actually said or what they meant, but I developed an appreciation for science through that. So my dad has now been a professor of physiology for 35 years, maybe 40, and publishes in Metabolism and Cell and Physiology, all of the major journals. His career is focused on how our arteries function and dysfunction and cardiovascular risk factors. So from a very early age, I appreciated the role of science in helping us better understand the world, so that we can navigate the world better and make better decisions, hopefully. And I would spend the weekends with my dad in the lab and watch him with the microscope, and I'd pop the white coat on, and I thought it was really cool. And so I always knew that I would eventually, one day when I was finished with school, explore something in the arena of science. And so I started with physiotherapy. I was very interested in working with elite athletes. I did that. I graduated and was working with professional athletes in Australia, and at that time I was focused on really injury rehabilitation and helping athletes get back to their best physical health so that they could resume playing their chosen sport at the highest level. And some years after that, I decided to go back to university and did the Masters in Nutrition Science, and the main reason for that was I reached this period in my career where I was working with athletes. I was very interested in nutrition myself, but I hadn't developed the skills to actually get into the research and navigate it and make sense of it. And like everyone, I was exposed to all of these different views about nutrition. And having done the undergraduate degree in science and appreciating the kind of role of science and formal education, I wanted to go back and develop that skill set so I could kind of make sense of this myself. And the real kind of underlying reason for that, what that really inspired me, was my dad's experience with his health. Okay. So when I was a kid, I was with him. It's a long story, I'll make it short. I know we have a lot to get through. But I was with him and he had a heart attack.
Oh.
And it was out of nowhere. He was 41 years old.
Wow.
And from the outside, he looked fairly healthy. He was kind of representative of a young Australian dad. He wasn't morbidly obese. He would work out 2-3 times a week, not with a whole lot of intent, but he was at least moving his body. Yeah. And he wasn't at McDonald's every day. He was eating the typical kind of Australian diet, which is better than a very ultra-processed diet, but I think still needs a little bit of work. And he had a heart attack. He was taken by helicopter to the nearest hospital because we were a fair way away. And so there was a lot of it was a very frightening experience.
Yeah.
And
how old were you then?
I was 15.
Okay.
So I was the one like on the phone and dealing with the ambulance and explaining the situation. And I followed him by road in an ambulance. There wasn't enough room in the helicopter. And by that time, my mum and brother had met us at the hospital, and we waited, and they saved his life, which we were obviously very grateful for, and grateful for the level of healthcare in Australia that allowed for that.
Yep.
But in the aftermath, days afterwards, and meeting with the cardiologist, we were very much told, my brother and I, that we need to be aware that cardiovascular disease runs in families, which it does, and that we should monitor our risk as we're becoming young adults. I was 15, he was 18. And that's kind of where the conversation finished, which is it's not bad advice. You should be monitoring your risk, particularly if you have a family history of a certain disease. But it was years later when I was going through the research and looking at how nutrition affects cardiovascular disease that I began to appreciate that a lot of these diseases that we have normalized in society today that are affecting people's quality of life and reducing their health span, although there can be a genetic component, a lot of it is because we're adopting the same lifestyles in our families.
Yeah.
And so rather than having this kind of feeling of being limited or controlled by genes, I became very empowered and was inspired by this information, what I could do to actually really lower my risk of cardiovascular disease and not have the same experience as my dad.
Yeah.
And so I developed, I guess, a bit of a healthy obsession, getting through the literature to really make sense of things and clear some of that confusion, all of those different views that you get, whether it's on social media or in magazines. And, over time, felt inspired to share that with others.
Yeah, no, that's thanks for sharing that story. It sounds absolutely frightening. And did you, after that, did you actually go and get your cholesterol checked and all of that kind of stuff? Did your dad have kind of things that, looking back, might have been red flags that you didn't see then?
Yeah, I've since spoken to him about that more, and he had some risk factors. He had elevated blood pressure, we may talk about that, and he had elevated cholesterol. He didn't have metabolic syndrome or diabetes, these other major risk factors that will elevate someone's risk. But he had a couple of risk factors in play, and he was probably very stressed with his work. He was working a lot. So there was a few risk factors. I didn't end up having any blood work done until my early 20s. Kind of wish I had of when I was in my teens, but I ended up getting blood work in my early 20s, and eventually once I had looked through the research and then was reviewing my blood work, I realized that even though I was feeling great in my 20s, eating the way that I was, I needed to make some changes if I wanted to kind of shift some of those risk factors.
Yeah, no, honestly, I had a similar experience in my 20s when I had my cholesterol checked, and it was high, and it was borderline high at 21, and I do have a family history also of heart disease, and so it's one of those things where, and I know that you've talked about this in other places too, where a lot of it is about a lifetime risk of exposure as well. So maybe finding out early on that this could be a challenge and making those changes in your 20s, it sounds like it's really beneficial.
Some people may have heard of pack years for cigarette exposure, and now in the lipidology cardiovascular literature, they're now referring it to as cholesterol years.
Yep.
So the cholesterol that you're exposed to over your lifetime is what determines the risk of atherosclerosis, so the buildup of that plaque. The interesting thing is, you mentioned there that your levels were kind of high, normal high. The average person's LDL cholesterol, at least in this country, is about 120 to 130 milligrams per deciliter. And some doctors will say that is normal. and it may well be normal if we're just going out and looking at where most people land, but it's not optimal.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
that's a really important thing for people to understand. There's a great study called the PISA study that's looked exactly at this. They wanted to take adults without cardiovascular disease and also, really importantly, without other risk factors. So they didn't have diabetes, they didn't have elevated blood glucose, they didn't have elevated CRP, so a global kind of index of inflammation. And they wanted to look at, okay, all of these low risk factor, people with low cardiovascular disease risk factors, do they have different levels of plaque in their arteries at different LDL cholesterol levels? So they plotted this, and you could see that about 50% of people that have quote unquote normal LDL cholesterol at 120 to 130, they're developing significant subclinical atherosclerosis. So they're laying down fatty plaque at that level that some may say is normal, and they're on the road to some sort of cardiovascular event, which doesn't occur overnight.
Right.
It takes, decades, 10, 20, 30 years. It's sort of bubbling away underneath the skin, and you may feel great, but you might be walking around with that cholesterol level and you are laying down plaque. So I just think it's important for people to understand that the kind of normal value is not always representative of optimal.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think my cholesterol at that time was around 120 something, right? So it was in that normal range. And to be dead honest with you, I've had really great physicians over the years, but none of them were concerned about it. They weren't concerned about it in my 20s. They weren't concerned about it in my 30s. And then only in my 40s, when things start to elevate around, hormonal changes for women, but this also happens with men as well, that's when people started to get concerned with it, but it was still subclinical levels of elevated LDL. So I think this is actually a really important message that you're talking about here, is because there's really an opportunity for people to jump in and start prevention a lot earlier than typically is indicated in the clinical field.
And we're talking about the number one cause of death
Yeah.
in this country. It's the most likely thing that's going to kill each of us. And it is not completely determined by, but it is very much initiated by the level of cholesterol in your blood, specifically ApoB. And we have very, very strong evidence showing that people that win the genetic lottery, and with the gene variants that they have, their LDL cholesterol is at, say, 70 milligrams per deciliter or lower. They're exposed to that over their lifetime. They do not develop atherosclerosis. They're not dying of cardiovascular disease. So, all of these other things like inflammation and type 2 diabetes, when it comes to cardiovascular disease, they're kind of like pouring fuel on the flame, but it is the LDL cholesterol, or more specifically ApoB, that is lighting that flame in the first place. So if you can get straight to that as early as possible in life and get it below that threshold to a level where you're not walking around or going to bed and you're laying down plaque, you're going to avoid that disease. And most of the kind of very credible lipidologists now are of the position that, unlike cancer, where we still need to learn a lot more to treat it and to prevent it, cardiovascular disease, we really have the information. If we could get the entire population down to below that threshold, we would almost eradicate at least atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, which accounts for most cardiovascular disease.
That is great, and I'm glad you mentioned ApoB. Actually, would you mind just kind of quickly explaining to us, like, what is the difference between ApoB and LDL? Because we are big fans of measuring ApoB in addition to LDL.
Let's do the quick explanation, and then if you want to double click on anything, you let me know.
Sure.
Our body had to, through evolution, come up with a sort of a way to transport fats in blood. Blood is an aqueous solution, like water. It's mostly water, and fats are not water soluble. So how are we going to get the fats that we consume or that our body makes, how are we going to transport them to cells that need those fats to produce energy, ATP? Well, Glucose, on the other hand, is water soluble, so that's an easy one. It can just dissolve into the blood and go through circulation and get to cells. Fats need to be transported by something. So the body came up with this kind of chaperone, and that chaperone is a protein. So what that allows is the protein kind of folds over the top of triglycerides, which are fats, and cholesterol, which are also lipids, folds over the top of them, almost like a beach ball, and encases them, and allows that to now dissolve in circulation because the protein is water soluble. These combination of lipids and the protein over the top are called lipoproteins. Okay, and people may have heard of that. With LDL is low density lipoprotein. It is just one type of lipoprotein. And broadly speaking, there's two families of lipoproteins. There's the ApoB containing lipoproteins and ApoA1 containing lipoproteins. Let's push ApoA1 to the side. Over the years, with research looking at what's causing the fatty plaque to be deposited in the artery wall, it's become clear that it is the ApoB protein which separates lipoproteins that can enter the arterial wall and become retained and kickstart inflammation, and those that cannot. Our liver produces a variety of different lipoproteins that contain ApoB. The primary one is VLDL, so very low density lipoproteins. So it sort of pushes these out into circulation, and they'll give off some triglycerides, and then they'll take on a new name, the intermediate density lipoprotein, or IDLs, and then they'll give off some fat to cells, and they become a bit smaller, and they become low density lipoproteins. All of these are ApoB containing lipoproteins. When we measure LDL directly, we're only seeing the amount of ApoB that is contained within these low density lipoproteins. We're not seeing the total ApoB count, which would be determined by adding up LDL plus IDL plus VLDL. So while LDL does usually represent 90% of ApoB containing lipoproteins, in some people it doesn't, which is important. When we are directly measuring ApoB, we get a summation of all of the atherogenic lipoproteins, all of the lipoproteins that can enter and damage the artery wall, as opposed to just looking at one of them. So that's probably sounds pretty complicated for someone that's heard that for the first time, and it is complicated. But in short, it's just a more comprehensive way to measure the risk of atherosclerotic plaque, your risk of laying down that fatty plaque in the artery wall, which eventually is what builds up and up and up and leads to a heart attack or a stroke.
Okay, awesome. I have to say that is definitely one of my favorite explanations of, like you said, a very, very extremely complicated topic. But the bottom line being that ApoB is a really excellent additional measure you can get along with LDL in order to give you an idea of the number of atherogenic particles in the blood. Is that fair? It's
the best marker, and second would be non-HDL, and then third would be LDL cholesterol. But if you can measure ApoB, given what we now understand, then it's going to be the best way for you to determine your risk of cardiovascular disease.
Okay. And for people who do have their ApoB measured, I'd say you as a nutritionist, like, what do you want to see in a person who might be trying to lower their levels of ApoB using, let's just start with using diet, first of all.
So I am a nutritionist. I have a master's in nutrition science, so I'm not speaking here as a physician, although I have interviewed Dr. Thomas Dayspring, which some people may be familiar with. We spent like 7 hours deep diving this and talking about pharmacology and diet and how all this works. But target levels are important for someone to understand, firstly. So what level of ApoB are you targeting? And this is really determined by your overall risk profile. So the research is very clear. If you're a high risk person, then your target ApoB level is going to be much lower than someone who doesn't have those risk factors in play. So what are we talking about? Well, someone who has type 2 diabetes or has uncontrolled blood pressure, hypertension, someone who has a history of smoking or is a smoker, someone who is overweight or obese. All of these affect the risk calculation, and you can do that with your physician. They can determine, are you someone that's moderate to high or low risk. Typically, if you're low risk, you want to be below 80 milligrams per deciliter. And if you're high risk, you definitely want to be below about 50 milligrams per deciliter. So that's important, so you know, what am I targeting here? Because that could be achievable through nutrition alone, or it might be that it's not, and it's going to be nutrition plus some pharmacology, right? So you have to work with your physician to understand your risk profile and what your target is. And it will also be determined by your genetic makeup.
I was going to ask if are cardiologists using genetic data to help them ascertain what somebody's risk profile is these days. At least in Australia, because I think in the United States not so much, but it would be really interesting.
I think they are starting to look at certain gene variations, and it might help guide pharmacology. So does someone have a genetic variation that's affecting cholesterol synthesis in the body versus cholesterol absorption? And so you could potentially, if you understand someone's genetic makeup, you could identify that, and that could then dictate what drugs that person would be best suited to, that'll be most effective. And you can also utilize some of that from a nutrition perspective. So about 20% of the population are hyperabsorbers of cholesterol.
I did not know this.
So they 10 to 20%, depends on what sort of study we're looking at here, but they will absorb more cholesterol in their small intestine into circulation. And that cholesterol that's in your small intestine is from the cholesterol you eat, plus also bile. So the liver will produce bile, which goes through a duct into the small intestine, and the purpose of that bile is to help with fat absorption. But bile is very cholesterol rich. And so about 1 in 5 people have a genetic variation to a receptor in the small intestine, which allows more of that cholesterol to come back in, which increases their cholesterol levels in circulation. These are the people that will have a higher response, or their cholesterol in serum in their blood will go up more from the consumption of eggs and shrimp, as opposed to someone else who eats those foods and doesn't get that same elevation in cholesterol. And that's partly explains why there's been so much confusion about dietary cholesterol, because there are hyperabsorbers, and then there are people where it still affects their serum cholesterol, but compared to other things like saturated fat, it's insignificant. So your question was, how do I think about this from a nutrition point of view? I went on a bit of a tangent there, but
no, that's great.
so top level, if we're thinking about blood lipids and we're thinking about getting ApoB down, we have to think about the liver and the liver's ability to clear cholesterol. That's the critical component here. So your liver has receptors on the surface of it. I often use an analogy here. So let's imagine that we're at a port where cargo ships are coming in. And the cargo ships are stacked with containers. Let's pretend that the cargo ship is the ApoB protein. And on top of that, those containers are cholesterol and triglycerides. So the ship's kind of taking them to drop them off. Well, this system works very well when those crane drivers are working and they're working efficiently. So the ship comes in, they emptying off these containers, and the ship goes back out. Those crane drivers are like your receptors on your liver. So when you have lots of them, they're not on strike and they're working hard, right? They're going to clear all of this stuff, and you're not going to get a backlog of these cargo ships. But let's imagine sometimes the union decides they need more pay and they go on strike. Okay, so now we don't have these crane drivers, but the ships, they sailed 2-3 weeks ago, so they're still coming in. All of a sudden, they're going to build up in the port, and they're going to throw down their anchor. And when they're throwing down their anchor, that's kind of akin to getting stuck in your artery wall and building up as plaque. What we want to do with nutrition is to recruit more crane drivers. We want more of these guys working and have them working more efficiently. So we need more receptors at the surface of the liver. And these receptors are called LDL receptors. We know that the makeup of the type of fat in our diet directly affects this. And this goes back to research in the 1960s. Ansel Keys started this with the diet heart hypothesis and his work with the 7-country study, and then has been corroborated in metabolic ward studies where you feed people different fats and you look at cholesterol. Saturated fats, and that's an umbrella term, so if we want, we could break it down because there's a lot of different types, but generally speaking, saturated fats will downregulate the LDL receptor. So the more saturated fat in our diet, the less of these crane drivers we have, the more of those cargo ships that are building up the ApoB. Okay. Whereas polyunsaturated fats do the opposite. They actually upregulate the LDL receptors. So when we're eating, more foods like fatty fish and nuts and seeds that contain a lot of these polyunsaturated fats, as opposed to foods like fatty cuts of red meat and butter in particular, which contain the saturated fats that downregulate the LDL receptor. The net effect is more of these crane drivers and better clearance of the ApoB containing lipoproteins, and so ApoB comes down. The effect, or the magnitude of that effect, is going to be somewhat dictated by your genes. And this is where being individualized and having a personalized approach is really important. So we can get all the information we want from studies, and that tell us about a certain diet and what was the average response. But you're not average. I'm not average. So you can take the information from these studies as kind of broad recommendations. But then I usually tell people to go, and if for example, in this scenario, someone wants to lower their ApoB, well, the primary thing you're going to be thinking about is the type of fat that you're eating. So find some changes. I mentioned some swaps there. Find some changes that you can do in your diet that you can stick to, and then retest. Where did your ApoB get to? If you're targeting 80 because you're a low risk person, did it get below 80? Oh, no, maybe it didn't. Maybe you didn't make enough changes. Maybe you only changed your diet 2 or 3 days a week. Is there more changes that you can make there to further shift the kind of makeup of fat in your diet? Less saturated fats, more polyunsaturated fats, and titrate it. So the diet that allows you to get there might be different for me. I might have to make more changes because of my genetics. But generally speaking, people will see that as they reduce saturated fat and increase polyunsaturated fats, ApoB comes down. The next sort of dietary constituent that people can look at is dietary cholesterol. But as I said, it's not going to affect everyone the same. So there are some tests that you can run that help you identify if you're a hyperabsorber.
I was going to ask that, actually.
Yeah. So you can test, without getting into the weeds here too much, that receptor that allows cholesterol back in through the small intestine into circulation, it's also the receptor that allows us to absorb compounds in plants called phytosterols.
Okay.
You might have heard about phytosterols, people taking phytosterol supplements to lower their cholesterol. That's because it kind of competes with the cholesterol in the gut to go through that door. There are some blood tests.
They're trying to jump in on that receptor, so then the lipids that you consume cannot jump in.
Right, so you have more of the dietary cholesterol and bile gets passed through the body and you excrete it. Now, the test that you can run is you can do a serum test. It's not widely available. It's probably only something that someone's going to do if they're high risk. They're really trying to work out high risk or someone is just against pharmacology and wants to go to the nth degree with their diet to get to goal. You can do a blood test that looks at the phytosterol levels in circulation, cytosterol and campesterol. And if those are markedly elevated, then that's a sign that that gate that's allowing in both cholesterol and phytosterols, there's a genetic mutation there that's allowing for hyperabsorption.
Okay.
So you use the phytosterols as an indicator that you're someone with a genetic mutation there at that. It's called the Niemann-Pick C1-like-1 receptor.
Okay.
Totally complicated name. But that would be a kind of surrogate marker, a way for you to identify, I'm a cholesterol hyperabsorber.
Okay.
And then you might be someone who's more inclined to dial back on the yolks in the eggs that you're eating and the shrimp, foods that are really rich in dietary cholesterol. Something that everyone can focus on after that is fiber. Fiber will lower ApoB, and we've spoken to the mechanism here already, so I'll keep it short. Types of fiber will bind up bile in the gut and prevent it from being reabsorbed. So it clears it, you excrete that bile. What's the net effect of that? Well, the liver says, hey, we need more bile to absorb more fats in our next meal. So the liver has to make this bile, and to do that, it says, hey, let's open up those LDL receptors, recruit more crane drivers. We need to pull in cholesterol so we can make more bile. And in doing that, it's pulling in these ApoB containing lipoproteins and drops ApoB levels in circulation.
So we're essentially like opening up the system to be able to create more bile, rather than the body just saying like, I'm actually pretty efficient at keeping the bile that I have.
Exactly.
And the more bile that you make, the more cholesterol or lipids that will be drawn out from the bloodstream where it is harmful and into the liver, so it can just do its job. Is that?
Yeah, and pretty much everything, whether we're talking about nutrition or we're talking about pharmacology, the way that all of these changes work, or the drugs work, is by getting the liver to upregulate the LDL receptor.
Yeah.
They work through different pathways, but the net effect is they all share a common mechanism. Recruit more crane drivers, clear more of these particles, stop that backlog, and when you're not exposed to that backlog of those cargo ships, you have much less chance of them dropping anchor and getting stuck in the artery wall, which then kickstarts the inflammatory process of atherosclerosis.
Okay, that's great. And actually, I think this is so important, because people want things to be very black and white, myself included, very often, where I just want to say, all right, well, I've heard that dietary cholesterol doesn't actually make a difference, on my total levels of cholesterol or something like that. But really what you're saying is that there are opportunities for some people, depending on what their internal system looks like, where real dietary investments and changes could dramatically, make an impact on ApoB. Yeah,
you can probably, most people lower their LDL cholesterol or ApoB by about 30% with dietary changes. So the dietary portfolio by David Jenkins, that's been shown in randomized controlled trials, which is equivalent to a low intensity statin.
Yep.
Which is not a bad result. Of course, someone needs to make changes to their diet that they can adhere to.
Yeah.
Because there's no point dropping your cholesterol by 30% for a month.
Yeah.
Again, it's about lifetime exposure. But overall, everything that I kind of just described there in terms of like lowering saturated fat, increasing polyunsaturated fats, potentially lowering dietary cholesterol, increasing fiber. This is why all of these different variations of plant-based diets, whether it's a Mediterranean diet or a pescatarian diet or a exclusive plant-based vegetarian or vegan diet, it's why those diets, in the research, time and time again, you see people with better LDL cholesterol levels, lower ApoB, and lower risk of cardiovascular disease.
What was the other nutrient that you were talking about in terms of gut absorption?
So fiber is what helps clear bile. which then helps lower ApoB, and then the type of fat that you're eating, so less saturated fats, more polyunsaturated fats, and depending on your genetic makeup, you may be someone that wants to also focus on lowering dietary cholesterol.
Okay.
Polyphenols, I mean, it's also important right now to just highlight, we're talking about one risk factor here, ApoB. It's incredibly important. But these dietary changes that I'm mentioning are affecting other risk factors. That swap in type of fat, when you eat less saturated fat and more polyunsaturated fat, even in weight maintenance, which means without losing weight, you get improvements in insulin sensitivity. And that's been shown clinically in a lot of trials. It seems to lead back to how these fats affect the liver in particular, and hepatic fat, so fat accumulation in the liver. When you compare saturated to polyunsaturated fats, even in eucaloric conditions, so there's no weight gain or weight loss, we see a reduction in hepatic fat, so less of this visceral fat, this fat, ectopic fat in the liver when people are eating more polyunsaturated fats, which lowers insulin resistance, makes you more insulin sensitive, which is another big risk factor for cardiovascular disease.
Yep.
What else happens? As you're lowering your intake of sodium and increasing potassium, which typically happens with these changes if you're eating more plant-based, and increasing polyphenols, the three of these in particular seem to combine to lower blood pressure. So more potassium and less sodium reduces blood volume, which helps lower blood pressure. And the polyphenols and also nitrates have this effect on arteries where they help them open up. You get vasodilation. There's 8,000, I think, different polyphenols, so we won't go into the details of each one, but these polyphenols are often what make your food very bitter. When you think about colorful plants, like they're often what give the blueberries the dark blue sort of pigmentation, and blackberries the black, and some of the green pigments that are in dark leafy greens, etc. All of these contain different types of polyphenols. The important point I'm making there that you will get a reduction in blood pressure, and like if you think about cardiovascular disease right now, what do we have to do to really wipe it out? Because we have lowered cardiovascular mortality over the last 60 years, but it's still killing too many people. And we have made great progress on certain risk factors like smoking.
Yep.
But if you wanted to eradicate cardiovascular disease, you have to get the population to an ApoB level of like 80, and at the moment we're at say 120, 130. So we know that. The blood pressure right now is probably one of the biggest remaining risk factors for cardiovascular disease. It makes the arteries more susceptible to this atherosclerotic sort of cascade and damage. And for every 20 millimeter of mercury increase in systolic blood pressure, you have a doubling of your risk of death from stroke, heart disease, or other vascular events.
That's the top number.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah, the top number for every 20 millimeters of mercury increase. So these changes to the diet that I'm describing will help lower that number, that systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure will both come down. Again, due to the reduction in sodium, increase in potassium, and then the increased exposure to various polyphenols and nitrates, which help open up those blood vessels. So it's a combination of these eating in this manner helps shift a handful of really potent risk factors, ApoB, insulin resistance, blood pressure, that are driving cardiovascular disease in the right direction.
Okay, awesome. So if you wanted to give people maybe like the top 5 most important things that you can do to improve your heart health, I think you've already mentioned them, but if you wanted to summarize them, like what would they be? What would you tell somebody?
Okay.
Especially actually for folks who may not know, like maybe they kind of look pretty okay from the outside. They feel pretty good. You know, are not, you know, presenting with all these
Let's go through
factors.
this. So number one is, let's start with blood pressure. Do you know your blood pressure? Mm-hmm. Is it 120 over 80 or 115 over 75? That's where we want it. If it's not, then you you have a decision to make. Do you want to try and make some dietary changes and increase your exercise? They're going to be the two biggest levers that you can pull.
We are definitely going to talk about exercise too.
And losing weight. So for every kilogram of weight lost, if you're overweight, if you're not at your ideal body weight, for every kilogram of weight loss, you'll lower that systolic the blood pressure number by about 1 millimeters of mercury. So if you needed to lose 10 kilograms and you lost that, it would come down by about 10 millimeters of mercury. The dietary changes that I've mentioned, so let's say you shift from a standard way of eating to more of a DASH dietary pattern. And a DASH dietary pattern, this has been studied a bunch of times in clinical trials looking at changes on blood pressure. It's a diet where there is an abundance of plant foods, fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, whole grains, legumes, a real emphasis on plant protein. And then the meats that are in there are leaner cuts of meats, so not the fatty cuts of meats, and fatty fish. And when people are eating that way, they tend to get about an 11 millimeter of mercury drop in their blood pressure. So I would be looking at modifying the type of diet that you're consuming, more whole plants, the types, if you're eating meat, it's going to be leaner cuts of meat, dialing down, of course, on ultra processed foods. From a body weight point of view, trying to get to your ideal body weight. There's a number of different strategies that can help people do that. Things like time restricted eating can be a tool. There's also different types of dietary restrictions, so low carb, high carb. It doesn't seem to be a winner that's out there. We seem to see pretty similar results. So find the way of eating that leaves you feeling most satiated. Maybe for you it's high fat and for me it's high carb. We don't quite know why some people do better on different ones yet. Or counting calories, or a combination of those, right? Ultimately, you're just using those as tools to help you fill up on less calories and lose weight in a way that's as easy as possible for you. We want as least resistance, because then you're more likely to be able to adhere to it.
Yeah.
So getting to the ideal body weight, eating more of a plant-based diet, and then exercise. There's a bunch we could talk about here, but if I was to say just at a kind of low-hanging fruit, 150 minutes a week of moderate intensity cardiovascular training. What does that mean? And this is in line with the exercise recommendations, which less than 30% of adults in this country meet. 150 minutes of moderate intensity cardiovascular training per week. That is, moderate means when you're exercising, let's say you're on a stationary bike or you're going for a jog, you're puffy, you're sweaty, but you could still speak. It's called the talk test.
Yep.
So if someone called you and you had to, you could have a conversation. But it's very different to just a leisurely walk with the dog.
Yeah. You
know you're exercising, and that person on the phone would be well aware you're exercising.
Yeah, like, what are you doing? Are you walking? Are you walking fast? Are you walking up a hill? Something like that.
But they'd be happy to have the conversation with you. They're not going to be too annoyed and say, I can't understand you, call me back.
I've literally done this on runs before, where I've been on the phone with somebody. I'm like, actually, you're helping me figure out if I'm in the right kind of low zone 2 endurance zone. So if you want to chat for 15 minutes, we'll talk.
Yeah, so this is exactly what people mean when they say zone 2. It's this zone where your heart rate is up a bit, you feel a little hot, sweaty, but you can carry out that conversation. And the reason why 150 minutes is in the recommendations and why that's important is we know that when you're doing that each week, you will dramatically reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease. So there's a recent study, this is 2023, looked at 800,000 US veterans that had been followed for over 10 years. They had varying levels of cardiorespiratory fitness, and they were able to categorize them as having sort of low, below average, above average, high, very high, something like that. I can't remember.
Did they look at VO2 max?
Yeah, so they were looking at a treadmill test, sort of VO2 max.
So lab-based VO2 max.
Right. Okay. And then looking at in this case, they were looking at their risk of dying, so total mortality. Wasn't specifically cardiovascular mortality. But they found that just going from low, so basically not doing anything, to a moderate level of cardiorespiratory fitness, which could be achieved with 150 minutes of this zone 2 a week, so we're not asking too much, they had half the risk of dying.
That's amazing.
So you can half your risk of dying from all causes, at least in a 10-year period, follow-up period, by implementing this 150 minutes a week. So that could be carving out the time to do, let's say, 2 60-minute sessions on a stationary bike and 1 30-minute session a week. I think most people can find the time to do that. Yep.
You can also multitask too, you know.
That's the great thing about this zone 2 is you could take your phone calls. Yes. You can take the work meetings. You can read. You can listen to a podcast.
Yep. That's one nice thing actually about being in this industry is nobody really blinks at you if you're just puffing in the middle of a meeting or something like that. It's more normal. It's more accepted, which frankly it should be, right? We have forced society to be this weird sedentary, glob. And so we should also be very encouraging, I think, of being able to take work meetings from a walk outside and all that stuff.
There's a guy that I want to interview who's like the greatest of all time in the exercise physiology sort of science community. His name's Frank Booth. He's based here in the States at Columbia. Same university my dad's at. So I've had some conversations with him. But he's famous for saying the human genome requires and expects a high level of physical activity for normal function.
Yes.
And I think we forget that the environment in which our genome was shaped was built upon movement.
Yes.
And so when we fail to move our body deteriorates.
100%. And it's so good for everything, right? Not just, actually, before we go into exercise, which I definitely want to double click there. If we go back to the point about blood pressure, most of us just have our blood pressure measured when we go into the doctor. So maybe once a year. I personally have been thinking about just getting a blood pressure cuff and getting more readings in between that kind of yearly doctor visit. And is that something you as a nutritionist would recommend to people to really fully understand where they are rather than kind of that punctate once a year measurement they get in a weird circumstance too?
For $40 or $50, if you can afford that, I think being on the front foot and thinking about these risk factors that we know contribute to disease and thinking about prevention rather than sort of reacting when things are too late. I think the more that we do that, the better we protect our health span. So, I invested $30 or $40 maybe a year ago into a blood pressure cuff, and I'm not using it every day or every week, but once a month or every couple of months, I'll put it on and just check that my blood pressure is still in a healthy range. And at least if it wasn't, it's an early way to identify, okay, maybe I need to go speak to a physician. Or maybe I need to look at my lifestyle at the moment.
Or when it's creeping up, but not just in the noise of, one measurement at the doctor's office, which has its own stressors.
And some people have white coat kind of syndrome where they go to the doctor's office and that blood pressure reading may not be reflective of what their typical kind of blood pressure is.
Yeah. I'd be curious to try it at home, before and after petting dogs or in a stressful environment, just to really see what the impact is. But no, that's really, really wonderful. And I'm glad you also mentioned exercise, and we talked a little bit about zone 2, more endurance type of training maybe rather than something that would necessarily drive up your VO2 max. But can you talk to us about the nexus between diet and exercise? And I guess that, the way I think of it is it's like a three-legged stool. My trainer says this. It's recovery, and recovery can be anything from petting a dog to making sure that you're sleeping enough to spending time with friends, right? Kind of like something that's emotionally gratifying and being part of your community. But then also there's exercise, and then there are your inputs. There's the nutrition that you're consuming. And at any one time, one of those things might be easier to work on than another, but they all work together. So, talk to us about the importance of exercise in kind of maintaining a healthy body along with nutrition. Like, how do they work together?
Yeah, in my undergraduate degree, we got taught that structure reflects function. And so the body is very adaptive. If you give it a particular stress, micro stress, it will grow stronger, it will adapt in a way to become more resilient. It will upgrade a system of sorts, right? So I think about exercise as a poly pill. There are medications or drugs out there called poly pills, and it's targeting some of the risk factors we've spoken about. So you could go and get a particular drug that inside it contains a compound that will target cholesterol, another one that targets blood glucose, another one that targets blood pressure. That's a poly pill. I think of exercise in a similar way, in that if done right with intention, that pill, as opposed to containing these different drugs, is made up of different stressors. So these very specific types of stress that target a specific system in the body and cause that system to upgrade. So, what are those different stresses? One is resistance training. That is a stress that causes the nervous system to update, but also the musculoskeletal system, the health and function of muscle tissue and also bone, all important for longevity. Then you have zone 2, which we just spoke about. So what's that as a stress, this steady state cardiovascular training? Well, you're mostly using slow twitch muscle fibers. These are our type 1. So they're called slow because they're slow to fatigue. You can just you can keep going with them. And they're the muscle fibers that are most dense in mitochondria. Mitochondria are kind of the power factories of our cells. They, in the presence of oxygen, they're where aerobic metabolism occurs. They take the sort of glucose and fats, these substrates, and they convert them from chemical energy into ATP, mechanical energy. We can move our body. So zone 2 really upgrades those mitochondria. So you get the improvement in mitochondrial function. You can build more mitochondria. And there's also a process called mitophagy that occurs where you clear out dysfunctional mitochondria. And this also ties into the longevity aging conversation. If people have been sort of tuning into that, one of the hallmarks of aging is dysfunctional mitochondria. So that's and zone 2, actually, let me just add on to that. Our VO2 max is a byproduct of lung capacity, our heart function, and then also muscle physiology and the ability to pull in oxygenated blood during exercise. And zone 2 helps improve peripheral vasculature, so the blood vessels going into the muscle. And in doing so, it does contribute to an increase in VO2. So you will get some increase in VO2 from that sort of moderate intensity cardiovascular training that we're talking about, zone 2. That's the stimulus of zone 2. Zone 5, which is high intensity, it's the stuff that most of us want to avoid, can make us feel like we want to throw up, is, you're up at now 85 to 95% of your max heart rate. Your heart is beating out of your chest. And usually this is done in sort of intervals. The most common interval that's used in studies looking at high intensity interval training is a 4-minute kind of interval where you're on a bike or running and you're not going completely all out. That would be a sprint, but you're going really hard and your heart rate's up. And you'll find when people first start this, they can't hold a 4-minute sprint.
Yeah.
So they have to build it up.
Yeah,
but
4 minutes is a long
time.
Like, that can be miserable.
Yeah. Yeah, and you probably need people around you motivating, and that's how they do it in the studies. But
It's just like real life. You always have like a team of people just running after you and motivating you for your HIIT workouts.
Yeah.
I wish.
Yeah, I wish too. So that stimulus is a little bit different. When you're exercising now at that very, very high intensity and there's less oxygen around, we start using anaerobic energy production system, which is now outside of the mitochondria. So essentially what the anaerobic energy production system is and why we have it is if the energy requirements exceed the amount of energy that our mitochondria can produce, then we need to have another way of generating that ATP. And so we can generate more ATP without the presence of oxygen. And this is called anaerobic glycolysis. Now, this is mostly done in fast twitch muscle fibers. So zone 2 is the slow twitch, zone 5 is fast twitch, fast to fatigue. So we can't hold it for very long. We get buildup of metabolic byproducts that cause quite a lot of fatigue. That stimulus when you're working at that high intensity is strongly directed centrally. So there's a very strong central stimulus there. That's what really causes the heart to adapt. So now we're getting more efficient heart function, increase in stroke volume, so we can pump more oxygenated blood through the body per pump, which helps increase VO2 max. And the other really neat thing for people to understand here is that zone 2 and zone 5, there's some interplay and sort of interaction and some science that speaks to the importance of having both. And in the middle, you're sort of in a bit of a gray zone in terms of the systems you're stressing. So remember I said having intent and stressing systems very specifically. That's what we're doing here. Zone 2, we're stressing those mitochondria and the slow twitch muscle fibers. And zone 5, we're stressing the heart, but we're stressing the fast twitch muscle fibers. And one of the really neat thing that happens is when you're exercising at very high intensities, we've all experienced it, you get fatigued and your power drops. So what separates an endurance athlete or an elite athlete from someone who has a poor aerobic base and is fatiguing sooner? Two things. One is that when they're exercising at high intensity, those fast twitch fibers are better at clearing metabolic byproducts, pushing them out of the cell. That stops fatigue. And the second is the slow twitch muscle fibers, which is really neat. They can actually accept some of those metabolic byproducts, lactate in particular, and utilize it to produce energy. Elite athletes have a really good ability to recycle lactate. They've trained their slow twitch muscle fibers in zone 2, and they train their fast twitch muscle fibers in zone 5. And so when they work at a high intensity, they can clear these metabolic byproducts. They can stop the pH in the cell from lowering, so they can buffer it better, and they're less fatigued and they have more power.
So if you are more of an endurance athlete, and by endurance, I'm going to say somebody like that might want to run an ultra marathon or a marathon, you are going to, of course, want to do a bunch of zone 2 training, but then zone 5 training is also going to be
and probably in terms of workload,
maybe.
it's because that high intensity training is so demanding, it fatigues the central nervous system. You're more likely to become overtrained and see an elevation in your resting heart rate, a reduction in heart rate variability if you do too much. It's a small dose. You don't need a huge amount. So probably 80% of your cardiovascular training is zone 2 and 20% is zone 5. And athletes across the board that are looking to improve their performance, these are things they've probably heard before. But I think that the everyday person who's maybe not doing the ultra marathon, I mean, if you have a body, you're an athlete, in my view.
Totally, 100%.
And doing these different
This is the marathon of life,
Right.
right?
Doing these different types of exercise, for me, what's happening is when you're investing in your exercise, you're being more intentional and you get a better result for the time that you're invested. And increasing your cardiorespiratory fitness by having these two different stresses, it makes life easier. You know, whether it's playing with your kids or carrying your kid up a big hill or whatever, all of these different daily activities, when we are more aerobically fit, they feel easier. We're less fatigued. So, you know, these can dramatically improve our quality of life just in the day-to-day in terms of ease of living, but then they're also protecting you long-term so that health span is being increased and we're decreasing the number of years that you'll experience later in life where you have chronic disease, and hopefully you never experience that.
Okay. So what would you recommend then for maybe somebody starting out, they're not on a regular exercise program, or it's just, you know, kind of, they do it when they can. Let's say they get it cleared with their doctor and they're, you know, they have an average VO2 max for their age and gender. Age and sex, I should say. What might be a good kind of starting program?
I would start with zone 2. You know, I think if you're not doing any exercise, don't jump straight into the high intensity stuff. You can build a really good aerobic base just with zone 2. So let's not overcomplicate it. And that get to 150 minutes as a starting point, but the guidelines are 150 to 300 minutes. So there's room to play there if you have the time to invest. You know, going up to 300, you're going to get even better improvements in your cardiorespiratory fitness. So if you're already at average and you're not low, then you might need to go above 150 to get some improvements in your VO2. Really depends on where that baseline is. So I would look at starting there, and then in terms of knowing if you're in zone 2, you can do the really crude sort of way of just talk test. Can you talk? Are you a bit puffy? And for some people, I look at this as a kind of a spectrum. For that person who's just starting out, it doesn't really matter. That's probably enough. And then you have someone who maybe they're a bit more of a recreational kind of fitness enthusiast, and they want to be a little bit more specific. You can calculate your zone 2 heart rate, and you can wear some sort of wearable that is giving you a real-time heart rate, whether that's on your wrist or chest strap. And there are a bunch of different calculations online. I would just say quickly, it's better not to find out your max heart rate, which these calculations require, it's better not to use 220 minus your age. That's been shown, although in some people it's fairly accurate, in many people it's not that accurate, and there's better calculations that are more validated, more accurate. So there's one calculation called Gulati, Gulati. That's the best calculation for women to work out their max heart rate. And then another one called Tanaka, Tanaka. People can Google these, they'll come up. That's the one that I'd recommend for men. And then
what kind of inputs do you need to sort of figure that out? You
just need your age and gender.
Okay.
Yep, for Gulati and for Tanaka. That's just going to give you your max heart rate. And then you will find online that you can calculate your zones just off max heart rate. It's more accurate to use your heart rate reserve. So there's another formula. So that's step 1, work out your max heart rate. Step 2 is, and once you've done this, it's kind of set or forget. But again, this is the intermediate person. If this is too complicated, just focus on the talk test. Step 2 is the Carvonen formula, Karvonen. And that formula will utilize what's called a heart rate reserve, which is the difference between your max and your resting heart rate. And which is kind of like your available beats for you. And so this now factors in that people have different resting heart rates, and there can be quite a bit of variability there. Often it's dictated by genetics and how fit you are as well. So that formula will then spit out, using the Carvonen formula, as long as you know your max heart rate and your resting, then it will spit out your training zones. So it'll say zone 1 heart rate, and it'll give you a range. Zone 2 heart rate range, all the way up to zone 5. And then now in your zone 2 and zone 5, with your wearable, you can make sure you're in the right heart rate range. So you're now, that's what I do. I'll track while I'm doing zone 2. Can I speak? Am I a bit puffy? where's my heart rate at? And,
That's great.
And one thing for people to be aware of is when they're first starting, I get asked this a lot, you might have your heart rate in range at the beginning in the first 20 minutes of zone 2. And you can talk and you're a little bit puffy. And then as it goes on, and this has to do with how aerobically fit you are and how long you can sustain that exercise for, as you get to say 45 minutes or 50 minutes, and this is much more exaggerated if you're dehydrated or haven't slept.
Okay, good to know.
You'll notice that although you can still speak, your heart rate starts going up out of range, going into zone 3. And this is called cardiac drift. The way that I approach that is just backing off on the wattage, or like how fast you're pedaling or the resistance, and just bring the heart rate back into your target range.
Okay.
And over time, as you're improving your cardiorespiratory fitness, you'll see that you can now do the 45, 60-minute session without having this elevation in heart rate, as long as you're hydrated.
All right, that's awesome. So, being intentional, if I can summarize, being intentional about what exercise you do, aiming first for that 150, and if you can do more, great. But being intentional about where you spend your time, focusing, let's say if you're a very beginner, focusing on zone 2, and you gave us some tips on how we can figure out if we're in zone 2 or not. The non-technology way would be that talk test. Using kind of technology or kind of math and calculations, you can go online and kind of estimate your maximum heart rate and then plug that into a formula that looks at your heart rate reserve, which you'll have to know your resting heart rate as well, which I imagine you can wake up in the morning and kind of check on your own. Is that how you would recommend people do that if they don't have a wearable that tracks their resting
first
heart
thing
rate?
in the morning before getting out of bed.
Okay.
Would be when you do that, and you might measure your heartbeats in 15 seconds and multiply by 4. And probably, if you want to be really accurate, do that over 7 days and take an average. At least 3 days. Because you might find, depending on your activity load the day before and how well you've recovered, that your resting heart rate fluctuates a little bit.
No, that's fair.
But I also have a page on my website that I can give you the link to that just summarizes some of that, those calculations and whatnot. But I think we started there with thinking of exercise as a polypill, so like the specific stresses. So zone 5, that was zone 2, and then the other really important stress is the resistance training. And I mean, there's many reasons to do resistance training, and most people are not. Again, it's like less than 1 out of 3 adults in America.
Why do you think that is? I'm like so interested to hear your response to this, but why aren't more people doing resistance training?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. I think life gets in the way. I'm not sure people realize how important it is. And if you're not someone that has built that habit over time, it can seem like, really hard work. And I think some people have just not found a comfortable way to do it. Some people don't like going to gyms, but that's okay. You can do resistance training at home as well. But the benefits of resistance training are huge, and it's not just about building muscle and the aesthetics of that. I think that also might turn some people off. This is really about priming the body to have healthier muscle tissue, which is very important from a metabolic point of view. So it helps you manage blood glucose, it makes you more insulin sensitive when you're lifting weights. It's important from an inflammation point of view. So one of the hallmark features of chronic diseases that sort of underpins them is this chronic inflammation. It's not like the acute inflammation where you roll your ankle and or you have an infection. It's either an acute injury or an infection, and the body sort of has this defense system where it rushes off to that sort of site of infection or injury and sends compounds there that can resolve it. And then once it's repaired, the inflammation goes away. That's what acute inflammation is. Whereas chronic inflammation is this kind of just low grade signal of inflammation. And a lot of that is driven through excessive adiposity, so fat, which is where many of these inflammatory cytokines come from, and also living a sedentary lifestyle. Because when we contract our muscles, chronic inflammation is not just a result of the production of inflammatory compounds. It's also a lack of anti-inflammatory compounds. We're out of balance. And when you contract muscle tissue is an endocrine organ. I'm not sure if people fully appreciate that, which means it can produce compounds that have similar effects to hormones and to the immune system. And so there's a bunch of compounds that fall underneath this sort of umbrella term, myokines. And as we're contracting muscle tissue, particularly during resistance training, there are various anti-inflammatory myokines. Again, remember what Frank Booth said. The human genome requires and expects a high level of physical activity for normal function. So for normal immune function, you have to be lifting your body, moving your body against resistance, some form. It doesn't have to be a weight at the gym. It could be your body weight. But improving insulin sensitivity, metabolic health, helping reduce inflammation, and then of course the benefits of being physically stronger. We know that grip strength, which is really a surrogate marker of just total body strength, is a very good predictor of longevity. And in fact, strength is a better predictor of longevity than muscle mass.
Interesting, actually.
Right. Which those two, there is some overlap. Usually when you build muscle, you'll become a bit stronger, but you can build strength without building a lot of muscle as well. And it sort of comes down to the type of training that you're doing, and also the nutrition that you're kind of pairing it with.
Yeah, actually tell me about that a little bit. If you wouldn't mind defining resistance training, first of all, what types of activities would you consider resistance versus maybe strength training or hypertrophy training? I think those terms can get...
I guess resistance training overall is just moving your body against any form of resistance, and strength and hypertrophy sort of fall into that. They're different types of resistance training. Strength training, like pure strength training, if we're talking about power athletes and people that are just focusing on sort of maximum lifts, they're really training the neuromuscular kind of connection. Strength is very much largely determined by neural activity and the signals that you're sending from your brain to the muscle, and there's a lot of skill development involved in that. And the best way to drive adaptations in strength is very low rep ranges, very high loads. So they're operating in the realm of 1 to 5 reps with a very heavy weight. I wouldn't recommend that for people that are interested in longevity. It is true, it's the best signal for building strength, but it can also lead to injuries and overtraining, and these things are not conducive to good long-term health. We really want to protect our body from injuries, because staying consistent with exercise is so important. And so that's the kind of, if we were thinking about strength from a kind of purity angle, right? If we're thinking about hypertrophy, then the research is pretty clear now that you can hypertrophy means increasing muscle size. You can increase the size of a muscle with a huge range of reps, anything from 3 or 4 reps up to 30. It doesn't matter. What matters is the perceived exertion, how far you take that set. So if you lift a weight that you can only do 4 reps on, and you take that to what would be described as 2 reps shy of failure. So if you were to do another 2 reps, you couldn't lift it anymore. That would be the same stimulus as if you chose a lighter weight and did 30 reps, but also took it to 2 reps before failure.
Got it.
So what matters is, are you getting to 2 reps shy of failure?
Yes.
And
hypertrophy.
that's what's called an effective set. So if we're thinking about building muscle, an effective set is choosing a load and doing a number of reps between 4 and 30 where you're 2 reps shy of failure.
Okay.
That's an effective set. If you finish the set, let's say you choose a load and you do 10 reps and you stop and you could have done another 10, that's not an effective set. Okay. So
is it still doing something good for you if you do that?
I'm sure it's still doing something, but I'm not sure it's really, you're not getting maximum bang for your buck in terms of the time that you're investing.
Yeah.
So it really depends on your goal and what you're doing. But I think a lot of people are going into the gym and kind of spinning their wheels a bit without the intent. And it's not to say they're not going to get any benefit. There's going to be mental health benefits probably from just showing up and doing it and accomplishing something.
You might not lose, maybe you don't lose things.
And you might not, you might be able to maintain. And also when you're brand new to any of this, it matters less. Whatever you do will produce some benefit. But as you become more and more experienced, it gets much harder to drive adaptations. So as your experience level goes up, you have to become more specific and your intent has to increase. And
you probably have a better idea of like where you are in terms of failure for a given set once you've been doing it for a year or two or however long.
Yeah, and some of that also comes down to taking a few sets all the way to failure. So you can feel it.
So you know where it is.
So you know where it is. And that comes with experience. So an effective set for hypertrophy, 2 reps shy of failure, and then how many sets do you need to do over a week?
Yeah.
Per body part, 10 effective sets. If you do 10 effective sets of, say, your glutes or glutes, hamstrings, your quads, and then for upper body, you can probably think of it more as like push, which is a vertical push and a horizontal push. I'm showing this on camera, but and then a pull, which is like a vertical pull and a horizontal pull. You want to be achieving or reaching 10 effective sets per movement pattern each week.
Okay.
And if you do that, you will be providing enough stimulus to induce hypertrophy, to grow that muscle. And you can take those sets anywhere up to 25 a week. Depends on how much time you have.
Yeah.
And again, where you're at in terms of your resistance training. If the more experienced you are, the more sets you need to do.
Okay. Yeah, all right. And you mentioned earlier that grip strength is really kind of a proxy for overall strength. So I'd love to hear more about that, because I think my grip strength is terrible, but I'd really like to believe that somewhere else in my body it's better off than just my hand grip strength. But I know it's really important because there is a true association with age. I mean, it declines over time, and it is associated also with all-cause mortality. So.
Yeah, well, I think it's become clear in the literature that association exists. But I don't think any of the researchers or scientists think that it's literally having the stronger grip that's keeping people alive.
Right.
It could be helpful in certain situations if you're falling or whatnot to be able to sort of brace yourself.
Yeah.
But it's fairly well established that it's just representative of if you're a person that has a strong grip, you've been an active person.
Yeah.
You're probably a person that also has strong hips. You can squat down to the ground. You can get up. You're probably a person that can get up out of a car. You can push yourself up off the ground if you need to. So it's more of a surrogate marker for your ability to move your body against resistance, which is really important as we're aging.
Probably pretty easy to measure as well.
It's super easy. So it's just like dynamometer.
Yeah.
And there's normative charts, so you can see where that's at. And look, there are some things you can do to improve your grip strength as well. Like you can do dead hangs, where you are just hanging from a bar, and you might do that on 2 arms. You might do it on 1 arm, and you can time yourself. How long can you do it? And that's another good exercise.
Probably also good for some other muscle groups too. And how about things like bone mineral density? And if we think about exercise and its impact on lifespan, health span. Bone mineral density, we know that exercise can provide improvements. Nutrition also plays a factor. So
this comes back again to sending a signal to the body, a stress, and it will adapt. And the best signal that we can send to the body to produce more bone is resistance training. And I kind of didn't complete what I was talking about before. I said that I wouldn't recommend people work in the 1 to 5 rep range. I think it just more likely to lead to injury. I prefer getting people to work between sort of 6 and 15 reps. And even though I said you could go up to 30, the reason for that is at 6 to 15 reps, you're going to choose a load which is sufficient to drive these adaptations in bone. If you're choosing a load where you can do 30 reps, the load's not enough to drive the bone adaptations that we want. So I like people, when they're doing their resistance training, I want them to get a combination of strength. They'll get a little bit of a increase in lean mass, particularly type 2 muscle fibers.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. What do you tend to build with resistance training in terms of fiber type?
Type 2, which is really important because as we're aging, when sarcopenia develops, which is the loss of muscle tissue and function and quality, it's mostly driven, at least initially, by loss of type 2 muscle fibers. So resistance training is the best way we can kind of reduce or attenuate that process. So 8 or 6 reps up to 15, getting 2 reps shy of failure, and trying to do 10 sets a week for some sort of squatting pattern, some sort of like hinging pattern, which would be more of a hamstring type movement, a push and a pull. And then I would actually add, and I didn't add before, the 5th movement pattern is like a loaded carry. So loaded carries is just if you're outside or at the gym, usually there's somewhere you can walk up and down, and it would be like holding kettlebells. As they're down by your side, you can do it holding 2, or you can challenge your core a bit more and just hold 1, going up and back. I forget where we started on this point. Oh, it was about bone mineral density. So as the muscle is contracting, it's essentially transferring energy from the muscle fibers themselves to the tendon, which then gets transferred to the bone, and that's what causes us to be able to move our skeleton. And what happens from a mechanism point of view and an adaptation point of view, and this kind of actually ties into what happens during menopause a little bit, is that kind of mechanical signal that goes from the tendon to the bone, it gets converted into a chemical signal. And the chemical signal is what drives osteoblast formation. Osteoblasts or activity. Osteoblasts build bone. They're cells that build bone. And the conversion of that signal from mechanical into chemical to get this increase in osteoblast activity is mediated by estrogen. So as a woman enters menopause, if they're not, presuming they're not taking hormone replacement therapy, naturally estrogen just sort of falls off a cliff. And this is the mechanism that explains why many women in that postmenopausal phase of their life, they go and do a DEXA, and their T-score shows that they're osteopenic or osteoporotic. So when we're doing our resistance training, we're getting all of those different benefits that we've discussed, whether it's metabolic benefits, it's inflammation, it's our strength, it's bone mineral density. So it is really important that we're doing it. And from a dose point of view, to achieve those 10 sets a week from those 5 basic movement patterns, I think the easiest way for people to do that is to do 2 or 3 sessions a week where they do what's called a full body workout. Yeah. And
so get all of those movements in twice.
So if you did 2 sessions a week, you'd have 5 movement patterns in the session that I explained. So you've got your squatting pattern, hinge, push, pull, and a carry. And you do 5 sets of each. And then maybe you do that on Monday, and then you do it on a Thursday. And across the week, you've done your 10 sets of all of them.
Okay. So that's actually building a nice, I'd say, kind of weekly plan for people. So what would you recommend? We have the 150 minutes of exercise. We have the 10 reps of the 5 different movements per week. So if you just try to wrap that up, what kind of looks ideal for folks that
yeah, so it might be, let's say Monday you do an you do a full body workout. Tuesday you do an hour of zone 2. Wednesday you do 30 minutes of zone 2. And at the end of that, because you're already warm and you always need to be warm before you do a zone 5, you go straight into a zone 5 workout, which we can go into the details if you want, but that's probably going to take them 20 minutes.
Okay.
Thursday, a full body workout. And then Friday, if my maths are right, is going to be a 1 hour zone 2. And now across that week, you've done 2 resistance training full body workouts, and you've hit the 10 sets per movement pattern. You've got 150 minutes of zone 2, and you have about 15-20 minutes of zone 5.
That's great. So that kind of fits it all in. Yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, I think this is actually what can be really helpful for people to figure out how. Then people have to figure out how to get all of that into their day, right? I wonder, actually, do you work with folks on helping them figure out how to do that? Now that you know what the program is and where you want to be, then how do they change?
Yeah, this depends on so many factors. How much time does someone have? Are they going to the gym? How much experience do they have in understanding exercise selection? Because if there's someone that has a lot of experience, then it can be quite easy to write them a program and they go. But someone might say, I have no idea what a hinge movement pattern is, what a squat movement pattern is. I'm getting on equipment and I don't even know what body group it's working out. So how do I know if I've achieved 10 sets? And I think that's what we've provided is like the overall structure and kind of template. But if you're a little bit overwhelmed by that, I would just write that down so you understand high level what you're wanting to achieve. I think most people can get their head around zone 2. That's probably the easiest point of entry. The resistance training, if you're really having trouble, there's a lot of resources online that can help. If you search those 5 movement patterns, you'll see loads of videos and instructions, free information. Or you could go and do a few sessions with a trainer and say, I want to have a full body workout twice a week where I'm hitting these 5 movement patterns and doing 5 sets of each. Can you help show me what exercises I would be doing and write it out for me? And then you probably only need a few sessions with them and you can go away, and maybe then you touch base with them after 6 or 8 weeks and see if you need to tweak or change anything to make it more challenging. And then zone 5, this is the one where I think most people find the most difficult to do by themselves. It's certainly the hardest. It requires the most effort. It's tough getting your heart rate up to 85 to 95% and sustaining that effort. I would just start very small. So rather than starting with like 4-minute efforts like we spoke about, start, whether it's on a treadmill or on a bike, with 30 seconds of very intense pedaling or running, and then stop for 30 and repeat that sort of 4 times, and over weeks build it up. You're going to find for most people though, at 30 seconds, it's very hard to get your heart rate into 85 to 95. It's just not long enough of an interval. So the purists out there will say that's not a great interval. But I think it does 2 things. It gives people confidence, and a lot of zone 5 is a mental game. You have to know how much you can push your body. If you're someone that hasn't been doing a lot of exercise, you'll be a little bit out of touch. So you can progress it over time. But knowing that the end goal is we want you to be able to do a 4-minute effort with your heart rate up.
Okay, that's great. That is really great. All right. So we talked a lot about nutrition. We talked a lot about exercise. I know that you touched upon inflammation for a bit. And another topic that we would love to be kind of have you weigh in on is the impact of diet and certainly exercise as well on brain function, which I know can also tie in with the inflammation concept. So I was saying if we switch organ topics a little bit and talk about brain health and cognition, and I think we know about diet and cardiovascular health. We know about exercise and cardiovascular health, but we don't really know about diet and exercise and brain health. And I'd say in the same way, it's not as commonly discussed around here. But you know that these things are very important. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the importance of diet, nutrition, and exercise on cognition.
Yeah, the great thing is from a nutrition point of view, what we see with cardiovascular disease is very much mirrored when it comes to long-term brain health. The same theme of eating that is conducive to a healthy heart seems to be the same theme that is conducive to a healthy brain and good long-term memory and executive function. Some of the kind of what I find most interesting research on this comes out of Rush University. There was a researcher, she's recently passed away, Dr. Martha Morris, who sort of pioneered or created what's called the MIND diet. And the MIND diet is a very plant-based dietary pattern. It's a combination actually between the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet that we spoke about before. Okay. It's made up of an abundance of fruits and vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes. It has one serving of fatty fish a week, and if there's meat, it's an emphasis on poultry as opposed to red meat. And unlike the Mediterranean diet, interestingly, there's no emphasis on alcohol consumption. In her research, they found that compared to people that adhere to that very poorly, those that have high adherence have about a 50% lower risk of Alzheimer's dementia.
How long do they have to adhere for to be sort of?
It's a great question. These studies were sort of 5 to 10 year follow-up.
Wow.
Right. So what would the risk reduction be if people were adhering to that for longer? I don't know that we fully know that. But they then kind of drilled in their research, looking at specific food groups and are there any kind of superfoods for the brain? I'm hesitant to use the word superfoods because overall the dietary pattern is what matters, and I want people to realize that it's the foods that you're eating consistently over decades that matters. But they did find specifically that people who were eating a serve of dark leafy greens per day had brains that were operating as if they were about 11 years younger. Wow. And the mechanisms or what could explain that are not fully understood, but it's thought to be one component within greens that may be contributing to brain health and protecting our brains against neuroinflammation and increasing neuroplasticity and the ability for the brain to develop new synaptic connections. It's these compounds called carotenoids, and specifically lutein and zeaxanthin. So they're found in arugula, beet greens, lettuce, all these different dark leafy greens. So I always recommend or use that as a way of encouraging people to try and have a daily salad with lots of dark leafy greens in there. And it's important to note that those carotenoids are fat soluble. So whether it's olive oil or nuts and seeds, you want to have some, or avocado, some form of fat in that salad will increase the absorption of those compounds, which we know increase blood flow to the brain. They increase brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So there's a number of different mechanisms that could explain why they're beneficial for your brain. But in short, daily salad with dark leafy greens and add some fat in there. The other food group that they looked at was berries. So again, they saw that people who were regularly consuming berries, they were less likely to have cognitive decline. And the the sort of hypothesis here is that this is driven by a specific class of polyphenols called anthocyanins. And there's actually some good randomized controlled trials now looking at kids and adults where you give people in a very short-term study a very high dose of these anthocyanins, and you do see an improvement in blood flow to the brain, improvement in increase in brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and importantly in outcomes like memory, information retention. And there's some studies, one study in particular where they did a blueberry smoothie, and were able to see 6 hours later that the subjects were performing better.
Wow.
So maybe if you have an important meeting or test or something, starting your day with a blueberry smoothie could be a good idea. Other components of the diet that seem to be beneficial are omega-3s, probably through the inflammation resolving mechanism.
Okay.
So the Alzheimer's dementia and cognitive decline is not fully understood, but there are a bunch of risk factors that we know are associated with the development or increase the risk of. And some of that is midlife cholesterol levels, insulin resistance, but also chronic inflammation in the brain seems to be increasing the risk of both cognitive decline and also mood disorders. And there is a very clear association that people who are consuming more omega-3s tend to have much lower risk of cognitive decline.
That's incredible. So, yeah, actually, sugar, in general. What is the impact of glucose or other carbohydrates on the brain?
So carbohydrates is an umbrella term. I think carbohydrates overall has been unfairly demonized, but that's because it spans from everything from a black bean to a jelly bean. And so clearly there are foods that contain carbohydrates that are not great for our metabolic health, and then there are others that are incredibly health promoting. So we have to kind of separate out the two. The unrefined sources of carbohydrates, so in whole grains and in legumes, these have a very different effect to your physiology compared to drinking a sugar-sweetened beverage or a cookie or a cake. And we see that in all of the outcome data, whether we're looking at cardiovascular health or risk of type 2 diabetes or Alzheimer's dementia in this case. Refined sugar, if you were to kind of say, what is the mechanism? Like, what's happening? Why is this a problem? I'm of the view that currently right now, the best explanation is that it leads to overconsumption of calories, increased adiposity. And that comes with an increase in insulin resistance. And then, of course, the increase in insulin resistance, which comes downstream of energy toxicity and excess of calories, leads to elevations in blood glucose, which leads to formation of advanced glycation end products and damage to the actual wall of the artery. So back to where we started this conversation, ApoB is the primary driver of atherosclerosis, but when you start adding in inflammation and elevated blood sugar, you're pouring fuel onto that fire. So that's the kind of primary way that I see sugar negatively affecting our physiology. It's excessive energy intake, and then you get insulin resistance, elevated blood sugar, and damage to blood vessels.
And is there really an overlap in maybe an enriched number of Alzheimer's patients? Are they also type 2 diabetics, for example? If you have type 2 diabetes, you are 60% more likely to develop Alzheimer's dementia. Okay. So clearly some of these mechanisms and risk factors that are the things that are driving type 2 diabetes are also placing you at risk of cognitive decline. Yeah. Okay, I think that's super important. And omega-3 fatty acids, and we talked about how their potential inflammatory lowering properties. I know that you can get them from fatty fish. I know you can get them from supplements. Are there other sources of omega-3s?
So there's different types of omega-3s. There's short-chain omega-3s, like ALA, which is found in plant foods like hemp seeds and chia and walnuts. And then there's long-chain omega-3s, DHA and EPA. There's others, but they're the primary two that are found in fatty fish and also in algae. So the fish get those long-chain omega-3s by either feeding on algae directly or from fish that eat other fish that fed on algae. So the start of that food chain is the algae. These, in terms of like how much of these do you need, the recommendations are probably to have the equivalent of 1 to 2 serves of fatty fish a week as a minimum. And from a supplementation point of view, that works out to be about 800 milligrams to 1 gram a day of DHA and EPA. Now, the really interesting and confusing thing with this research is that when you look at supplementation of DHA and EPA, whether it be for cardiovascular disease or mild cognitive impairment or mood disorders, depression, the results are all over the place. So you'll have one trial where it looked like it was beneficial, and then next it wasn't beneficial. And so what might be explaining this? I think, and this is the hypothesis of many of the scientists in this space, is that in a lot of these studies, they're not measuring the baseline level of omega-3, the status of those subjects in that study. So whether or not an omega-3 supplement may have a beneficial effect on a particular outcome might be dictated by your baseline intake of that nutrient. So if you're in some studies like the Vital study, which is looking at cardiovascular disease, low fish intake subjects saw benefit, but people that were already consuming fish didn't see benefit. That tells me that perhaps there is a certain amount that you need, and then it just tapers off, it hits a ceiling. And it might explain why in the mild cognitive impairment studies and in the studies looking at depression, we see the same thing. You see one result suggesting that there's benefit and the next suggesting there's not. Unfortunately, a lot of those studies didn't look at the omega-3 index of their subjects.
Right. That's wild. Like, why didn't they?
Yeah, there's a lot of new nutrition trials that, for whatever reason, usually financial, don't do that. So the same thing exists with vitamin D studies. Often they're not looking at the baseline status, vitamin D status of those subjects. So it can be difficult to know whether that supplement is effective or not when you're not understanding where your subject sort of baseline is at. So I think that recommendation of 1 to 2 pieces of fatty fish a week is a good one. And if you're not, whether you're for sustainability reasons or ethical, or you just don't like fish, then I would supplement. And you can supplement with a DHA EPA from fish oil or a DHA EPA from algae oil. Both are available now. And I'd be looking at 800 milligrams to a gram a day.
Okay, that's great. And besides just sort of brain health, what would you imagine some beneficial impacts of this would be?
If you have high triglycerides, they might help lower your triglycerides a little bit. If you have very high triglycerides, then you may want to speak to your physician about the high dose omega-3 supplements. So there's a trial called the Reducer trial that looked at a very specific type of omega-3s. It was a 4 gram a day dose, and that can now be acquired via prescription in this country. So you might qualify for that. But most of the benefits seem to be driven through inflammation, resolving inflammation. So I think that's kind of the pathway where there might be some cardiovascular benefit and potentially some benefit for warding off cognitive decline as we age.
So things like lowering CRP.
Lowering CRP, and also I should add, from a brain point of view, as you're increasing these polyunsaturated fats in your diet, you change the cell membrane. the cell membrane makeup. So you have more of these polyunsaturated fats in the cell membrane, which can be released. And when they're released in the brain, these polyunsaturated fats are involved in cell signaling. They're involved in synaptic plasticity. They're involved in neurogenesis. So it's not just inflammation. I don't want to minimize it to just that. There are a bunch of different sort of ways where these polyunsaturated fats seem to be improving brain function and physiology.
So this is something you can measure directly in the neurons. I'm assuming humans are not getting brain slices to this, at least while they're alive, but people have seen a greater incorporation of these fats.
Yes.
That's wild.
Yeah, and there's a bunch of preclinical animal data that is kind of, when we're reviewing science, so you often you have to look at different types of study designs. You're seeing these clear patterns and trends where people that are eating more fish or have a higher omega-3 status are having less cognitive decline. And then you might run some short-term clinical trials like we spoke about, which have their limitations too. You can't run them for decades. And then you look at animal studies and sort of in vitro studies where we're looking a little bit more at mechanisms. And what we're trying to do through all of these different study designs is look for converging lines of evidence. So things that are pointing in the same direction. No, that's great. And actually one of the things that we really like about you is your evidence-driven approach to all of this. And certainly it takes a lot of expertise to pick a topic and then read everything that's ever been published about it, right? And then try to kind of synthesize all of that information in the various factors that go into interpreting that information to come up with like a conclusion that you can then, maybe talk to somebody who doesn't have a background in nutrition like you do and kind of, synthesize and understand really what is the outcome of, let's say, 50 different papers that look at the impact of omega-3 fatty acids on a given cognitive test, right? So there's different layers of evidence. And what are some of the different layers of evidence that you're looking for? Because you talked about animal studies, you talked about studies that may have identified a correlation between two really interesting things. And then other mechanistic studies that are really trying to understand the causal pathway that might link a correlation that you see. So how do you approach that topic when you have, let's say, a new research topic in front of you? Well, at a high level, there's an evidence hierarchy. So this kind of speaks to the reliability and validity of different types of evidence. Down the bottom is sort of expert opinion and anecdotes. Like if I was just to say something without any evidence to support it, that's pretty weak. And then a rung above that is the preclinical, this is petri dish or animal studies. And these are really important for us to look at mechanisms, to zoom right in on things. But they are also very reductionist. There's a fly.
There's a fly.
Yeah. They can be, they're highly reductionist, but they have their place. They can help us generate hypotheses that we want to then test in studies with humans. Above these studies is observational research, and there are different types of observational research. So you can look at retrospective, where you're going back in time and looking at a population of people. You can look at cross-sectional, which is one time point. So I have a whole heap of people in front of me right now that have breast cancer, and I'm going to look at what is their diet today, or a whole group of people, some with and without breast cancer, look at their diet today and see if there's any associations between diet and cancer. That's considered a little bit less reliable than the next form, which is prospective, where you can actually track people over time. So you can look at what someone's eating and then repeatedly every 2 or 4 years keep reassessing and look at whatever health outcomes. So those are all observational epidemiology studies. And then the next level above that in terms of reliability is randomized controlled trials. These are going to be shorter term. Often they're not long enough to look at hard outcomes. Did someone get dementia or cardiovascular
Right.
disease. But what we can look at is surrogate biomarkers. So did some sort of exposure to a supplement or a nutrient or a diet, did it affect cholesterol, or did it affect blood pressure, or did it affect inflammation? Things that we know or believe we know are predictive of a certain disease. And then above that, we have meta-analyses, and you can do a meta-analysis of observational studies or of randomized controlled trials or both. And a meta-analysis is essentially a way of combining a whole lot of data, different studies from all around the world, different research groups, but that looked at the same question. And sometimes they can give us more signal, but they also have their problems because the quality of that meta-analysis is determined by the quality of the studies that they include.
Yes.
And I mean, that's just a high level way of how I kind of am looking at evidence.
That's great.
But once you're in a study and you're looking at the nutrient or so a compound or a food, there are so many things you have to be thinking about. Exposure, how much of that? What was the dose that we're talking about there? What was it compared to? For who? Are we looking at a population of university students? Are they male? Are they female? Are we looking at postmenopausal women? Are we looking at elderly? And so there's all of this context that you have to appreciate. You know, if we're looking at a certain food and saying, is it healthy or not? Well, what was it being compared to?
Yeah.
What's the comparator? Because when someone's eating less of something, they're eating more of something. All of that context is really important for sifting through the research. And what you usually find is at a surface level, if you just read headlines and on social media, you think that there's all this conflict. But actually, when you appreciate the context, it's fully explainable.
Yeah.
And so
That's important.
a lot of that does come back to time. There's so much time invested in getting into the studies and reading through them properly and thinking about the study methodology and asking questions and speaking to colleagues and becoming a domain-specific expert. And so, you know, I'm quite often asked questions about areas of science that I know nothing about. And I just tell people that. This is not my domain. I think one of the best pieces of advice I can give people is, you know, I don't expect people to kind of quote unquote do their own research. I think that that's an unfair expectation. If someone hasn't gone to university and been trained to jump into all the literature and make sense of it, I just think that's unfair. And also most people don't have the time to do that. They're busy in their own lives with their own careers. So they have to be able to find people that they can trust. And so just high level, is that person a domain-specific expert? Are they dedicating their life to that particular area of science? That's a good first sort of clue. And then, are they someone that is speaking about different types of studies and the limitations and the strengths of those studies? Are they speaking in absolutes all the time, very confidently, or is there a little bit of grey? There's a little bit of nuance. And that's a tricky one because on social media, the more confident you are and the more absolute you are, often people see that as trustworthy. Whereas the more reserved and nuanced message looks as you're not confident. Maybe you really don't know, but it's not that you don't know. It's that you appreciate the greyness. And, you know, science is about reducing uncertainty, but there will always be some uncertainty.
Always.
And so we're getting closer and closer to a truth, but we have to stay open-minded and, you know, not be overly kind of dogmatic, I think, in our positions and be open to changing. So if there is something new that pops up and it's challenging older ideas, we should at least be open to reviewing that and thinking about it and expanding, upgrading our views over time. Those are all different things that I would be looking out for in whatever area of science you're interested in to find people that are going to give you trustworthy information.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I actually think the simple test of I don't know the answer to that is like such a green flag. And I totally agree with you. I feel like people who have dedicated their lives to research and understanding science tend to use more language like it could do this, it may do that, because they're always leaving room for error, and that error might be because we don't fully understand something. But it also, kind of to your point, could be that maybe this works for one person but doesn't work for another person. So that's another kind of conflict I see on social media a lot, is everybody wants the black and white answer, but also for it to be personalized for them. And it's hard to do that. That's, people are pretty different. Like you said, maybe folks that actually weren't ingesting a lot of omega-3s, they're the ones that are most likely to benefit from it. So they're a different group than the people who are eating fatty fish once or twice a week. It's a different population for that question. So no, I think that's really wonderful. It's a great primer for, how to wade into the world of wellness and research and know where to go. So I really appreciate that. So one of the things that we would like to ask you about is different types of body fat and the distribution of different types of body fat and how that can have an impact on disease and disease prevention, mortality, any sort of harder outcome risk.
So where we store fat really matters. And there's three main sort of fat depots in the body. Subcutaneous fat, which is underneath the skin. There's visceral fat, which is fat that we store between organs. And then there is ectopic fat, fat that we store inside organs. And the most damaging fat is the visceral fat and the ectopic fat. That's really where we don't want to have a lot of fat accumulating. Where we would like to have fat accumulating, and it can be very healthy as an energy storage site, is subcutaneous. Not too much, but we want to have some there. And in many ways, we have evolved to store quite a bit of fat from a survival point of view, and it works very well in a environment where we don't have an abundance of calories. It protects us. But where we run into problems is when that subcutaneous fat storage site is full. And what happens then is that those extra calories that need to be stored as fat end up spilling over into those other two storage depots, visceral between organs and ectopic inside organs. And Roy Taylor in the UK, who's done a lot of great research on metabolic health and type 2 diabetes, he was really interested in why is it that you can have two people that have the same body fatness, but one of those persons has insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, but the other person is sort of getting away with it. And they seem, relatively speaking, metabolically healthy. And it seems to come down to what he describes as a personal fat threshold. So each of us, dictated by genetics, but also lifestyle to a degree, and particularly our hormones. So if we're super stressed, if we're sleep deprived, or if we're going through menopause, there can be changes to hormones that lead to a shift in terms of where we're storing fat. But ultimately what ends up happening is that some people will be able to store less subcutaneous fat for a given body fatness. And so they're more susceptible to the buildup of fat in and around the organs. And a lot of the time when I talk about this, people say, well, where's my personal fat threshold?
Yeah, that was my next question.
How do I work this out? And really, the best way of understanding if you're over your personal fat threshold is by looking at your blood work. There will be clues in there, as well as some basic measurements like waist circumference or waist to height, waist circumference to your height. And there are some charts out there. Depending on your ethnicity, you can see where you would fall. But blood work, so looking at fasting insulin, fasting blood glucose, triglycerides, these are going to be three big indicators of being above your personal fat threshold and having fat building up in those organs. Because as we build up fat, particularly in the liver, the liver is really the master regulator of metabolic health. And as we get more and more fat building up in the liver, that correlates very strongly with an increase in insulin resistance in the liver. And the downstream knock-on effect of that is elevations in blood glucose. It's elevations, at least initially, in fasting insulin, HbA1c, and in the case of someone that develops type 2 diabetes, what happens is they develop fat in the liver, And then over time, that results in more fat coming out of the liver in the form of triglycerides. This has to go somewhere, but your subcutaneous fat stores are full. So it ends up going into other organs like the pancreas. And this leads to the beta cell dysfunction. And then over time, that person's less and less able to produce insulin. HbA1c is going up, and they get to 6.5%, and they're diagnosed with type 2 diabetes.
Yeah.
Roy Taylor's work he wanted to know, okay, how much weight do I need to get people to lose on average to get them back below their personal fat threshold once they've had type 2 diabetes, and what happens? And he was able to show in the direct trial and a couple other trials that he's done as well, if people can lose 10 or 15% of their body weight, providing they haven't had type 2 diabetes for too long, then they can actually go into remission, which means 10 or 15% of body weight, they're getting enough of that fat out of pancreas and the liver, and as a result, their blood glucose control returns to normal without medications.
Just incredible. Yeah.
Right. So that's people with type 2 diabetes, but I think everyone else, if we're thinking about this, metabolic health is a spectrum. So it's not like you either don't have diabetes or you do have diabetes, or you don't have insulin resistance or you do. You'll fall somewhere along that spectrum. And so the important kind of takeaway point here is we want to keep fat out of our organs. To know that, do your blood work and look at your fasting glucose, triglycerides, HbA1c, fasting insulin. And then also think about it's not just excessive adiposity. There are also some dietary constituents, types of nutrients that will drive fat in the liver and insulin resistance. And the predominant thing for people to think about here is, we spoke about it earlier, is saturated fat. So there are very clear human feeding trials where you feed people saturated fat, it's randomized, to feed other people polyunsaturated fats, and you see saturated fat drives up liver fat. It drives up insulin resistance. So from a metabolic health point of view, the type of fat that we eat is really important. But ultimately, as you started out here, saying where we store fat matters. And if you're doing your blood work, you're making sure that those key markers are at an optimal level, then you're going a long way to know that you're below your personal fat threshold. If those are out of range and you're overweight, then chances are you have excessive amounts of fat in and around those organs, and you're going to want to find a strategy that allows you to lose weight, which is kind of why drugs like Ozempic are becoming popular.
Yes. So, and we could definitely talk about Ozempic too, because I know that it's a very hot topic. But even before we get to kind of a pharmacological intervention, it's very reversible. It seems like to a point, especially, and you can track where you are with something like HbA1c. You can track how close you're starting to creep towards that threshold of being kind of officially diagnosed with diabetes versus not. So I think that's one of the nicer blood-based biomarkers that we have.
Yeah, this is another one of those things where, like cardiovascular disease, where we know what to do. It's just a case of we have to do what we know.
Yes.
And weight loss is a challenge.
Yeah.
It's hard. The long-term results in trials are not amazing.
Yeah.
So I can kind of empathize with people if they've tried to lose weight and they're finding it difficult. But that is the road to remission, is you have to get the fat out of those organs. That will bring back insulin sensitivity. And so a big part of that is going to be finding a dietary strategy that allows you to be in a calorie deficit, and that feels easiest, and you lose weight and get below the personal fat threshold. In addition to some of the other kind of lifestyle factors that can affect fat distribution, and I kind of briefly mentioned two before, but stress and sleep are two big ones. So there is definitely evidence in an association form showing that people who are much more stressed tend to have more visceral fat. Mm-hmm. And that might be to do with differences in cortisol, among other differences in hormone balance. And then there's a really interesting study that came out, I think it was last year, it might have been 2 years ago now. With COVID, it's making everything blurry. Where they took a group of people, and it was a crossover trial, so you got to do both sides of this study, but they were looking at how does sleep deprivation affect calorie consumption and visceral fat distribution. And they compared, I think, 9 hours a night or 8 hours a night to 4 hours. So they sleep deprived people, and this was like for 2 weeks, 4 hours sleep a night. And it was an ad lib study, so you could eat as much as you want. And they saw very clearly when people were sleep deprived, not only did they eat more calories, about 300 calories more per day, they were preferentially storing that as visceral fat. So there was a switch in terms of where that fat was being stored. So it's not just about what we're eating and our body weight. It's also about the sleep we're getting or the sleep we're not getting, the mindfulness practices we're doing or not doing, and therefore the stress that we're carrying.
Yeah.
All of these things can influence the distribution of the fat.
Yeah, that's great, and that's really important. And I'm always thinking about how to reduce stress and how to essentially fit all of this in. How do you fit all of this in? Like, how do you, if you're just like a standard person with a 9-to-5 job that is relatively sedentary and you need to work in order to live where you live or raise your kids where you raise your kids, it can be, I think, daunting to try and think about making sure you get enough sleep and making sure that you recover and getting your exercise program in and all of that. So I think we see people that just might feel overwhelmed about having to make all of those changes.
It can be overwhelming, and I don't have the perfect answer to that, but what I would remind people is that it's not about being perfect. You're far better off being consistent and imperfect over the long term, over decades, than you are being perfect for a week or two. So don't beat yourself up too much.
Yeah.
Take a bit of pressure off.
Yeah.
And also, like, if it sounds like there's a bunch of things that you're not doing in your life, you don't have to implement them all overnight.
No, that's hard.
Find your feet. And we know that from habit formation. If you try and introduce too many things at once, they're unlikely to stick.
Yep. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I was actually going to ask you if these longevity experiences that you provide to people, is this part of what you talk about to help them actually take what they learned in this kind of 6-day window and then apply it when they go back home and are out of that probably great environment for them.
Yeah, we try and break it down and give people realistic goals. Understanding someone's goals is really important, and where their life's at now and how much time they have. And we try and also just get people really confident in the practices. So it's very immersive, hands-on. So like a lot of these things we're talking about, zone 2, zone 5, resistance training. I think one of the barriers is the overwhelm comes from not knowing, not being confident. And once you're taught and someone's given you the time to show you, it's not actually that complicated. And then at least, that's one less barrier. So you can go away and that. And I think a lot of people walk into the gym and honestly, they're just not sure that what they're doing is correct. And, therefore they're less kind of motivated to be in there and they don't get the results. So my aim is to kind of give people more intent, whether it's with the food or with the training, because I think that intent leads to confidence, and then that's going to lead to results.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's not easy to do all of this.
No,
I think the take-home message is to do it imperfectly but consistently.
Yeah, I think that's a great take-home message. And I was actually going to ask you this earlier when you were kind of talking about your own personal journey in terms of how you became interested in this topic and where you ended up in terms of a career. I know you work with a lot of folks, right? What would you say, is there a story or two out there that of somebody that you worked with anonymously, if it's okay to share, of course, where they really they really were able to kind of turn things around and start meeting goals that they didn't even know maybe they had before. But like, are there any fun stories in there?
I think my mum has a pretty good story.
I love it.
She was living a typical Australian lifestyle as well, and got into her 50s and 60s in, I guess, okay health. She had breast cancer, and went through radiation and came out the other side and has been in remission for quite a while now. She was diagnosed off the back of that with osteopenia, which is osteoporosis in her family. And, I think the hardest people to inspire change in is your family and close friends. Even though they're the ones that you want to change the most.
Yeah.
So my approach has always been quite hands-off and wait for people to come to me. And, she wanted to make a bunch of changes to her diet and wanted to start changing the type of training she was doing. And so she's done that. She eats like a sort of Mediterranean diet, but there's basically no ultra-processed foods now, loads of plant foods, very high fiber, lots of color. We looked at, is she getting enough calcium and protein and B12, important nutrients for bone mineral density? And she set up a resistance training program. She's sending me videos, squatting. And like, this is one of the things that I think people need to understand is you often put these limitations on yourself and think that there's no way I could do that.
Yeah.
My mum's like mid to late 60s and squatting with a barbell on her back and doing deadlifts.
Yeah.
And we have studies showing when you there's a study looking at 80 and 90-year-olds doing resistance training and they can build strength.
I love it.
So she's engaging now in this resistance training exercise program that also has some cardiovascular training and like boxing and skipping, which is great for bone density as well, having some of that impact stuff. And she's had her DEXA redone and is pretty much back in the normal range.
Oh, I love it.
So, and she's done that without medications. It's not that those medications are not helpful. There are like certain bone mineral density medications that people can tolerate. She wasn't tolerating one of them so well, so she wanted to try and do it just with training, and has done really well so far. So it's been cool to kind of watch someone that I'm so close with go through that. But yeah, it's, she's been really happy with the results.
Oh, I love that. I love like hearing about the spark in any sort of change like that. And especially you said she undertook a resistance program and started in her late 60s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she loves it now. Like if you asked her, she's all about it. She's telling all her friends about it.
Yeah.
And inspiring them to do it.
Yeah. That's really wonderful. Yeah. That's really great. Okay. Another question I have for you is, what have we not covered? And I know we'll do kind of a rapid fire round of things, but are there any topics that we haven't covered that you'd really love to talk about, that you feel passionately about?
Gosh, where do we start? I mean, I think we've done a great job covering a lot of different topics. I often get asked about supplementation and what's my philosophy with supplements. I think the low-hanging fruit is filling any gaps in your diet. So with blood work, you can see if there's any kind of major micronutrients that you're not getting enough of, and you can approach that through diet, or maybe you need the assistance of specific supplements, whether it's iron or B12, depending on your life stage, gender, micronutrient requirement, diet, all of these sorts of things. But I'd say plugging nutritional gaps is important, and I think supplements can complement a diet from that perspective. I think there are certain prebiotic supplements, like prebiotic blends, that can be helpful in different circumstances. One is if someone is not tolerating a lot of plant foods and needs to sort of increase their the diversity of their microbiome in a very controlled way before they can add in more plant foods. The other instance that I can think of now is if you're taking antibiotics.
Yeah.
So
that's a big one.
I think there was a lot of talk maybe 5-10 years ago about taking probiotics if you're taking antibiotics, and maybe it helps. The jury's out. There are some studies suggesting that could delay the repair of the microbiome potentially. Might not lead to any negative results long term, but it might delay it. But certainly prebiotics, because they're like the fertilizer, they're feeding the microbes, the good bacteria in your gut. Combining those while you're taking antibiotics might be a way to limit some of the kind of collateral damage that occurs. So as the antibiotics they're sort of indiscriminately, targeting these pathogens, and they wipe out the good ones at the same time. And if we feed those good bacteria with the substrate that is prebiotics, which really stands for resistant starch, prebiotic fiber, and polyphenols. Polyphenols are prebiotic. Then hopefully we can keep more of those guys thriving and also get a quicker recovery. So that's those. I think protein supplementation, if someone's not meeting their the protein target for them. If you're an athlete and you're looking to build strength and muscle, we haven't spoken too much about this on the nutrition front, but 1.5 to 1.6 grams per kilogram should be where you're targeting.
Yeah.
If you're someone that's not really worried about squeezing out every last bit of water out of that towel, then 1.2, 1.3 grams per kilogram in a lifestyle where you're moving your body against resistance is, you're going to get really good adaptations to that, both hypertrophy and strength. So that's protein. Creatine, I think there seems to be some cognitive benefits. So this is not just a supplement for people working out. It's quite preliminary, but it looks to be effective in terms of improving cognition in day to day. I don't think we have any long-term data to know if it reduces risk of cognitive impairment long-term. But I think 5 grams a day is probably something that everyone should supplement. You're not going to get that through your diet. And
what are typical sources of creatine?
Mostly in meat.
It's hard to get.
But you need to be eating, a kilogram or more of red meat to get anywhere near that a day. Which would then be negatively affecting other risk factors. So it's probably not the best strategy. But you can get creatine monohydrate. That's what's been studied most. It's shown to be safe at 5 grams a day, even up to 10 grams a day. And you'll get some benefits if you're training as well, from a hypertrophy point of view as well.
Okay. I was laughing when we were talking about the protein discussion because my son said to me, "Geez, Mom, you work out all the time. Why aren't you buff?" And I was like, A, I like to consume cookies. And I'm like, B, I don't think I eat enough protein. And, I honestly think that. So, and I talk to people about this. And yes, if you're not consuming enough protein, then you just you're not going to have the right building blocks.
So the resistance training piece is that's like the primary anabolic stimulus. But in order for that adaptation to occur, it then requires nutrients.
Yes.
Primary nutrient being amino acids, which is what our body breaks protein down into amino acids. And then those amino acids get taken up by the muscle tissue after resistance training, and they use them to adapt and grow stronger, grow bigger.
Can you actually gain strength without hypertrophy? Like,
yes.
How does that work?
Yeah. And even in the strength rep range that I said before, you probably get some growth of muscle too. It's not just neural. There's some overlap. But look at the strongest people in the world. They're not the biggest.
Yeah.
Bodybuilders are the biggest, and they are not the strongest.
Yeah.
They're still strong compared to the average person.
Right.
But you can be the strongest person in the world without being the biggest.
Yep. Yeah, all that makes sense.
So it's not just the size of the muscle that dictates the strength. That's the take-home message there. There's a big neural component to that.
And I have another question actually about supplementation, and we didn't, we don't need to go into this in major detail, but kind of processed versus unprocessed foods. And what about getting kind of proteins or other nutrients through some of these processed foods? Like, are processed foods in general getting better such that they could be reasonable things to incorporate in your diet if you don't have the time or something like that? Or is it just a hot mess no matter what?
I tend to think this is more nuanced than people probably think on face value. And there's a lot of debate on this right now, because even within the ultra processed food category, not all the foods are equal.
Yeah, I think that's more what I'm asking too. Is are there benefits in some cases to an ultra processed food that?
I think it comes down to the characteristics of the ultra processed food, and they're still trying to tease out, what is it about ultra processed foods that drives overconsumption of calories? Because that's the primary thing that's happening.
Okay.
And Kevin Hall's research showed that a few years ago. He looked at people eating a completely ultra processed diet versus unprocessed, and everyone was crossover. You were in a metabolic ward, so they tracked everything you ate, and he actually matched macronutrients, so protein, fat, carbohydrates, sugar, fiber. Everything was matched between the two diets. Just one was ultra processed and one wasn't. And that's kind of like evening the playing field, because that doesn't happen in real life.
Yeah.
And people consume 500 more calories per day on the ultra processed diet.
So was he matching the ratios of those different macro and micronutrients?
All
or
the
was
ratios.
it
And then
the
ad lib,
total?
you could eat as much as you want.
Okay.
But the
so
ratios,
your absolute numbers could be higher or lower,
Right.
but the ratios were the same between
Exactly.
the two groups. Got it.
Yeah. And sodium was also matched. And the hypothesis there was calorie density plays a big role. Usually ultra processed foods are much more calorie dense.
Yeah.
They have less volume and fiber and water. They also have less protein usually, but he did match that. And they ate them faster.
Yeah.
It might be eating rate. So
Yeah.
eating rate might lead to, if you can eat these foods more quickly, there's less satiety, and therefore you may overconsume calories.
Yeah.
So do I think, like, if you're asking like a protein powder, is that considered ultra processed, and should we just not consume that because it's processed? I don't think so. I think that overall what matters is the overall dietary pattern. So I think of these supplements as complementing the dietary pattern. So if the dietary pattern is based on whole foods and not 60% of calories from biscuits and cakes and cookies and ultra processed foods like that, which is the standard American diet, then I think there is room for some of these foods that might be classified as ultra processed, but they're not foods that we would say are seductive in nature. I think we all know what are the seductive foods. The candy bars, the biscuits and the cakes. That's different to putting 30 grams of protein into your smoothie.
Yeah. The Snickers bar isn't the same thing as kind of a thoughtfully planned out smoothie, I suppose. Yeah. Okay, that's great. I honestly, personally feel like I will never be able to meet my protein goals unless I supplement in some way, shape, or form. But, all right, we have a couple of rapid fire AMA questions that we could go through. And let's start back on the insulin resistance question and talk about the very popular pharmacologic intervention, Ozempic. Your feelings on Ozempic, who should be on it, who shouldn't be on it, and has it been shown to actually demonstrate sustained weight loss? And I guess we could further qualify that with, does sustained weight loss occur when you're on it for a long time, or if you're on it for a while, you're doing really well, and then you go off it? How about the weight loss sustained?
Okay. Remember, I'm not a physician.
Yeah.
So
yes.
I've read these studies and I'll comment, but I think people should talk to their physician about this. It's a GLP-1 agonist, so it binds to a GLP-1 receptor in the brain, and this affects appetite. The results are pretty positive at it's kind of 64 weeks, I think it was. There's a trial that came out recently, which is the longest term trial that I've seen, which was 2 years. At 68 weeks, they had 14.9% of their body weight they lost. And then at 104 weeks, so 2 years, they'd maintained that. So 15,
were they still on the drug for that long?
15% still on.
Okay.
So my understanding is that once you start, you won't come off of this drug, unless someone was experiencing some sort of side effect or just really wanted to. But I think it's being prescribed for people that have tried other ways to lose weight and haven't been successful, and they have these metabolic health consequences. And it's still not fully understood, but there is definitely a hypothesis out there that part of the reason why some people find it really hard to lose weight is due to changes in the brain. And they respond differently. The reward centers of their brain are different. And this drug helps to normalize that in these people so that they experience a similar level of satiety to other people when eating the same type of meal. So I think that's the way for people to think about it. It's that, obesity, there is a underlying physiology. This is beyond willpower. There is some physiological changes that are occurring, brain chemistry, and Ozempic, at least initially now, seems to be proving effective to help target that and then allow people to lose weight in a way that feels easier and is sustainable. And at this point in time, 2 years is pretty sustainable weight loss. No,
that's great. Keeping on this trend, is Berberine nature's Ozempic?
No. I mean, it works through a very different mechanism. It's not a GLP-1 agonist. It can help improve blood glucose control. There was a meta-analysis recently that people have cited to suggest that it can help with weight loss. If you look in that meta-analysis, I think 4 out of the 5 trials, there was no significant weight loss. It was kind of all over the place. And then there was one trial where they lost 2 kilograms over 4 months. So much smaller magnitude of effect. And that was just in one trial that wasn't replicated. So at this stage, I think there's definitely some benefits for blood glucose control and potentially liver function with Berberine. There's a lot of trials looking at that. But if someone's in the position where they need to lose 10 or 15% of their body weight, we can't compare Berberine to Ozempic. They're completely different. And I don't think Berberine's going to, in that person, help them get below the personal fat threshold, which is going to see them put their type 2 diabetes into remission, get enough of that ectopic fat out.
Okay, got it. All right, can plant-based protein help meet your nutritional needs? So maybe plant-based protein versus animal.
This is a big question. There are some differences between plant and animal protein in terms of the amino acid distribution. It is good for the record to let everyone know that all plants contain all 9 essential amino acids. There's some myths out there that plants are missing them. They're not missing them. All 9 are there. It's just that they're in a different ratio compared to animal proteins. Now, when is that important and when do you need to think about that? That is really only important if you're eating with very little diversity. Say one food for all of your calories. If you're in a developing country and all you have access to is rice. Then if you just ate rice for all your calories, there would be an amino acid, an essential amino acid that your body can't make that it needs, that you would fall short in. But once you're eating in just modest diversity, even if you're getting all of your protein from plants, providing you're eating enough calories and you have legumes like tofu and tempeh and beans and lentils, and you have nuts and seeds, and you're not missing any of those food groups, then you're going to get all of those amino acids that you need in the right amount. And there's an app called Chronometer, which is a free app. You can plug in your food over the day, and it will actually break down the essential amino acids. So if anyone wants to actually see this, just put in your day of eating. It'll show you your total protein intake and then also the 9 essential amino acids, and it will show as a percentage of how much you require.
Okay, cool.
So that can be the proof for you.
Awesome. All right, here's another one. What is one nutrient that doesn't get enough attention that you think is critical for the body?
Iodine.
Iodine, okay.
Particularly for people that aren't consuming seafood or regularly consuming seafood and dairy, because they're going to be two sort of major sources in the typical diet. Iodine is really important for production of thyroid hormones, T3, T4, which regulate metabolism. They have a big effect on energy levels. So if you're lethargic, this is often one of the nutrients that you want to look at. Also affects hair quality, nail quality, a bunch of things. So if you're not consuming fish regularly or dairy, then there's sort of 3 options for you. One is to regularly consume certain types of seaweed. So dulse flakes and nori flakes, people can buy them at the grocery stores, and it's about a teaspoon or so of that a day. You can turn it around. You want to get 150 micrograms of iodine per day. If you're pregnant or breastfeeding, it's 220 or 270 micrograms. That method or route of seaweed, I find, is probably the least preferable option because people forget. So you have to be really dialed in. The second is iodized salt. So you can buy iodized salt now at most grocery stores, and you can swap that over for whatever salt you were using. You're going to need about 1/4 teaspoon of that a day. So that's one option, to use that in your cooking and on your meals. And if you have high blood pressure and you've been told to reduce sodium, you can buy a low salt. It's called low salt, which is a potassium chloride salt. And they have an iodized version of that too. Third option, which I think is like the most reliable, certainly, again, someone that's not eating seafood or dairy, is to supplement potassium iodine. Find iodide, find whether it's a multivitamin or just by itself, one that gives you 150 micrograms per day.
Do you feel like actually are a lot of people kind of iodine deficient? Like more
Huge
people
number.
than you would think.
Yeah, and this was a problem many years ago, and that's why iodized salt came out. But iodized salt is being used less and less. Pink salt and all these other salts became very popular. I think some people are eating less fish. So it's definitely something to be aware of. And also when you're testing, often the best way to test your iodine levels is a urine test. So it's not something that people are routinely testing for. So if you're feeling lethargic, low in energy, brittle hair, brittle nails, any of these sorts of signs, or gaining weight, another one, unexplained, then it would be worth doing a urine iodine check, and also just looking at your diet and thinking, am I getting 150 micrograms a day? Again, you can use that app, plug in a day of eating, and it will tell you.
Okay, amazing. Great PSA. All right. Can intermittent fasting help reverse insulin resistance? If so, how?
Yes, if it helps you lose weight. So again, that's one of those tools that people can lean into or not if they are looking to reduce their body weight and get closer to their ideal body weight. It's just a dietary restriction strategy.
To eat, consume fewer calories and then get the benefits of that on the other end.
It's not magic. So when you compare it to calorie counting, if people are eating the same calories in a restricted window versus outside in a larger window, there's no differences in body weight. Intermittent fasting works from a weight management point of view by giving you less hours to eat, and as a result, you eat less calories.
Okay, so a good mental trick. So there really isn't a body of evidence that really points to you needing to fast for a certain amount of time in order to stabilize your blood sugar peaks or something like that.
No, there's a little bit of evidence that speaks to people with pre-diabetes. So once you're insulin resistant to a certain level and you're having some problems with blood glucose homeostasis, that's when the hours that you're eating seem to be most important. And we were speaking about this off air, but the research there sort of points to the optimal eating window being shifted earlier. So say a 10-hour eating window, but starting that an hour or two after waking and finishing that. So you might, let's say you wake at 7, you start at 9 a.m. and your last food is therefore at 7 p.m. And you go to bed at 10 or whatever, and so you've had 2 or 3 hours before bed of no food. That eating window, sort of the earlier eating window, particularly if you have your biggest meal at breakfast, second biggest meal at lunch, and then the smallest meal at dinner, that seems to be best from a metabolic health, blood sugar control point of view for someone that has pre-diabetes.
Okay. I think that's an important distinction too.
Yeah. So the research in people without diabetes really hasn't shown that matters as much. And so again, this is context. Who are we talking about in these studies? And how does that relate to you? So I would say if you're someone that doesn't have pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes, then your eating window and earlier or later, you might be overcomplicating things, even focusing on that. Focus on diet quality and being able to sustain that, adhere to it. Because the last thing I would want to do is someone who actually has good blood glucose control thinks, oh, I've got to eat all my calories early in the day. And now all of a sudden they have poorer social life. They have problems adhering to that because they like to go out for dinner with their friends. So yeah, I think that conveying the context there is important.
I think you actually just hit on something really very helpful, which is you just identified a problem that wasn't a problem, right? And you might be able to help somebody focus on the right thing instead of getting all obsessive about what time you're eating. Maybe there's something bigger out there that they could be worrying on that would have a much bigger impact on their health and would be easier for them to adopt just from a whole lifestyle perspective.
Yeah, they might be focused on eating in this perfect window and they're doing no zone 2.
Yeah, right.
Let's free up some of that mental exhaustion and focus. Just keep eating the diet over whatever hours it is. You're metabolically healthy. You don't have pre-diabetes. Focus on diet quality, and then let's put our energy into like building your exercise out.
I think it must be really helpful for people to come and have kind of that outside perspective applied to their own worldview, which might be, everybody gets kind of stuck in their own pattern.
There's a saying,
somebody just say it.
There's a quote, stepping over dollar bills to pick up pennies. And that's what happens. Because we see all these little shiny objects, but we're overlooking the big levers that make the biggest difference.
You can cold plunge all you want, but maybe you should just be consuming more olive oil.
Right. Or cold plunge and have a shot of olive oil.
Or both. I know. We always talk about this too, which actually is another question I'd love to jump in here and ask, which is, what do you do if you have somebody that comes to you and they want advice on how to make changes to their diet and improve their overall health, right? And, you tell them to do a handful of things that might seem pretty generic, like consume more nuts and seeds and healthy fats. And, maybe you need to swap out some element of your diet for something else. And maybe you need to take a couple of supplements. And they're like, yeah, but I already know all of that. Then how do you help them dig in and really figure out what they need to do? Because we get this a lot where one of the most common recommendations we have is for people to consume olive oil. And the reason why is because they have certain blood markers that are out of range or not optimized. But also there's a really healthy body of evidence that has specifically looked at olive oil. I think like 100 studies plus. So how do you sort of have a conversation with that person who's like, I know I read the New York Times article about olive oil.
I think you have to dig deeper. This is where psychology comes in.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Why the inaction? Why is someone not taking steps or acting in a way that would be aligned with their values? Because if you spoke to them, they'd probably say that they valued their health and well-being, but they're failing to show that in their actions. So understanding, what is that? Is it related to fear? there's an interesting study looking at people at the end of their life. And I'm not sure if this is going to answer your question, but let's throw it out there and workshop it. And they're looking at what people regret at the end of their life. And more often than not, when people are on their deathbed, they are regretting the things they didn't do, inaction. And when we act in a way that's according to our values, very rarely is that something that we regret. If you think about actions that we take that we regret, usually it's things that we've done in our life that were not aligned with our values. So when I think about this study of regret, because regret to me, if someone at the end of their life feels a lot of regret, that says to me that they left a lot of happiness on the table. They probably weren't entirely satisfied with their life, which I think is sad. So I think that often people, there's an element of fear attached to acting. What I like to explain to people is that as long as those actions are tied to your values, those are not going to be the things that you regret long term. What you'll regret long term is the actions that you didn't take, right? And any actions that you did take that were misaligned with your values. So you have to start from the bottom with someone in this position, getting very clear on what it is that they value, right? Because until they've actually examined their life and understand what those values are, then it's very hard to set goals and inspire them to make change. And I think a lot of the times you'll find that when you just keep digging deeper in terms of their value set, you know, with regards to health, it's going to come back to family and to friends or kids. And, you know, wouldn't it be sad to be a parent to kids and when you're 70 or 80 and you've got chronic disease, looking back and regretting not taking action? So forecast today, knowing what you know and about the food changes that you could make that are going to make you healthy, what are you likely to regret in 30 years? It's going to be the actions that you're not taking today. And I think when people can get clear on that, so what are their values? What are the things that they're not doing in their life that are aligned with those values and that therefore they're likely to regret in years to come? Then hopefully they can be inspired to actually, you know, change the trajectory of their life and change the course and their behaviors on a daily basis. There's no easy answer to that.
No, not at all, but that's great. And is that how you start the process with people? Is do you kind of
values.
start with values?
You have to start with values, and people need to be very honest with themselves. What actions are you taking today that are not aligned? So, for example, if you value your parents and your kids, but you're always overseas, well, that's misaligned. Is there something that you can do there? You value your health, but you're drinking alcohol every day. You're not aligned there. It's going to be something that you regret at some point. And you have to work through each of these. And so you have to be very honest, you have to be vulnerable to get through this, and, you know, sit down with a piece of paper and write down all of the things that you value in your life. Think about the actions that you're taking and just work out, like, are they actually truly aligned? And then you have to have the mental fortitude to want to change that.
No, that's great. And it's we don't talk a lot about the psychology behind all of this, but it's like the glue that's holding all of the action together, I suppose.
And I think when it comes to diet and health, for some reason we like to think we're different. We're not going to end up with the diseases like everyone else. We're invincible. That's like a narrative that can play in the head. But, you know, if you do the same thing as everyone else, you can't expect a different result. And I think it's very small percentage of adults in this country do not have chronic disease. So if you're free from chronic disease and you're not considering your diet and your exercise, then you're probably on the path to chronic disease.
Yeah. Yeah. I heard that you did an inside tracker test.
Yes.
Yeah. So how was it?
That was fantastic.
And be dead honest.
No, it was great. I was in LA and organised it, so they came over to my Airbnb, and it was seamless service. It was 5 or 10 minutes just drawing the blood, and felt nice to kind of be doing it in your own environment. Even though I was in an Airbnb, I'd been there for a month or so, and yeah, just 10 minutes, and then the results show up in the app.
Yep.
Super easy to kind of analyze and see where things are normal or optimal, or where things could be slightly improved. And I'm looking forward to doing the second test and then the third test and seeing like progress. And it's nice to have your results kind of stored somewhere centrally that you can easily refer back to.
Yeah.
Because most of my blood tests that I have done in Australia are usually just on my doctor's computer, and then they'll print something out.
Yeah.
And inevitably I end up losing it. So I have a pretty poor history. So I think that's kind of, other than the advice and recommendations that come with it that I think are really powerful for people, I also like just the fact of having good, clear records.
Yeah.
So in 10 years time from now, you can look back and just see how things have changed.
No, that's actually super important. I was going to ask how often do you normally have your blood biomarkers taken for?
I probably do at least a couple times a year.
Okay, so you're higher than average, I'd say.
Yeah, I probably do.
Using them to track certain
Probably do a couple
things.
times a year. And I think if people are making more changes in their lifestyle, and they can afford it, more frequently, the better.
Yeah.
And if someone has certain chronic disease conditions, they might want to be doing it more regularly.
Yeah.
And then, if you're someone that is in good health and your lifestyle and everything's stable, then you need to do it less frequently.
Yep. No, all that makes sense. I mean, I printed out my results and I've handed them to my doctor many times, and they've been like, thank you for filling in the details, because we wouldn't have had all of this had you not had it done. Especially with markers like ApoB and insulin, which are not normally
and some of those
tracked.
tests, even though there's clear science to warrant ordering them, sometimes doctors can be a little bit hesitant to actually order them. I get that feedback from people all the time. I went to my doctor and I tried to get ApoB, but they had not heard of it, or they said it's not any better than LDL cholesterol. So,
or you're going to be charged for it different.
Or you're going to be charged.
Your insurance isn't going to cover this.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, awesome.
Cool.
All right. Well, this has been fantastic. It has been a long, wonderful ride. I cannot thank you enough for coming here and sharing all of your voluminous expertise on diet and exercise and the psychology behind it all, and the way that you work with folks. And it was super motivating and really just a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. It's been great. Hopefully have added some value.
Absolutely. And I really, just personally, I very much appreciate the evidence-based approach to everything that you do, and speaking both on the level of how do we apply the results from various types of studies, taking those actions in your daily life, really great, but also explaining some of the really complex biological mechanisms behind a super messy topic at times, for sure. So thank you very much.
Appreciate it.